Okay, so we are live. Welcome to the Seriously Wrong presents Library Socialist Book Club reading for Chapter 3 of Post-Scarcity Anarchism, which is our current reading group's text. So I am Sean, and I've got with me a few guests today who are going to help read through the text. So maybe do we want to go down the list of everyone who's participating, just starting in alphabetical order there in Discord?
Well, I guess I'll start because I'm up top on the list here. I go by Nmas on here, and I was here last week, and that was a lot of fun. So I might have a little bit more input on this week's topic because it's kind of what my career is. So expect maybe a couple of rants, and I think there might be a short story in there.
Oh yeah, because you're a machinist, right? And this is a chapter that deals with machinery.
Yeah. This is I'm super excited for it.
Yeah. I'm Aaron, and I'm jumping in for the first time today, and excited to be here. And this is going to be the first time I've ever read this actual chapter too. So I'll be learning as I'm reading, and so we'll see how much I have to say or how much I process while we get going.
Am I next?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Rosa. I love listening to things, and so I thought I'd contribute to reading things out loud.
That's awesome. Well, happy to have you. And we've also got Steve here. Do you want to introduce yourself, Steve?
Hey all, my name's Steve, or Masubi. I'm a social ecologist from Calgary, Alberta, and I'm looking forward to reading this because I haven't read it.
Excellent. So I've just put the link in the description in the book club group for people who, if they want to share the stream with their networks. And another thing that I'll just note at the beginning as we get started here for people is that this is a live recording. It's not edited. There might be a few flubs, misspeaks and stuff. I think it adds character. I think it's fundamentally human and wonderful to have those sorts of flubs. But if one thing to look for we want to create a resource basically that people can access these texts in another way and make it more accessible, and that's sort of the impetus behind starting these streaming services. Or streaming services would be like a platform, but the creating this reoccurring stream on Thursdays around the book club. That's what I mean to say. And I just had a huge brain fart because it's live, and you don't always know exactly what to say. But we want this to be a resource that over the next week people can listen to it, share it on, and you have the option also on YouTube settings to go to 1.25 or 1.5 speed. I usually find that helps with unedited conversation. If I can be a very fast thinker, and it's try out where on the scale it fits. I know a lot of people listen to podcasts at increased speeds. I think in particular this might be this sort of reading is a good thing to try it out. So folks, do you want to maybe trade off every page to start and go through, say, go Nmas, Aaron, Steve, Rosa, myself, Nmas, Aaron, Steve, Rosa, myself, and see how that goes?
Sure.
Yeah, it sounds good. You can always just adjust on the fly kind of thing. So
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Works for me.
Radical. So do you want to take it off from the top, Nmas, towards a liberatory technology?
Yes, towards the liberatory technology. And I must note that this is a slightly edited edition. Any of the edits you see in green are my doing. It's mostly just on gendering and perhaps pronunciation aids and definitions, which there wasn't a lot of in this chapter. It's actually not nearly as deep as the previous chapter.
Yeah, and the first time we'd found that there was it was written in the 60s, there was a lot of references to man to refer to humanity, this like genderless man, which sort of rubs us the wrong way, petting the dog the wrong way. And also the other thing is that there's some really inaccessible terms in language. So we want to try to take the time to explain that sort of stuff when we can. And so NMAS did some great work in compiling this document and adding some definitions to it. You might also notice this document is in Comic Sans. That's because Comic Sans is a fun font for kids, and if you don't like it, you're a hater. No, it's actually because it's an accessible font for it's easier for people to read who have dyslexia. And similar things to that than something like Times New Roman. In future streams, we'll be using an open dyslexic font, but we weren't able to get that together for this week.
Yeah, I wish I knew about that right when I started editing. And I just realized that I missed, like, on the first page here, I missed a deal. But anyways, so we'll just get right into it. So this is towards the liberatory technology. Not since the days of the Industrial Revolution have popular attitudes towards technology fluctuated as sharply as in the past few decades. During most of the 20s and even well into the 30s, public opinion generally welcomed technological innovation and identified man's welfare with the industrial advances of the time. This was a period when Soviet apologists could justify Stalin's most brutal methods and worst crimes merely by describing him as the industrializer of modern Russia. It is also a period of time when the most effective critique of a capitalist society could rest on the brute facts of economic and technological stagnation in the United States and Western Europe. To many people, there seemed to be a direct one-to-one relationship between technological advances and social progress. A fetishism of the word industrialization excused most of the most abuse of economic plans and programs. Today, we would regard these attitudes as naive, except perhaps for the technicians and scientists who design the hardware. The feeling of most people towards technological innovation could be described as schizoid, divided into a gnawing fear of nuclear extinction in one hand and a yearning for material abundance, leisure, and security in the other. Technology, too, seems to be at odds with itself. The bomb pitted against the power reactor, the intercontinental missile against the communication satellite, the same technological discipline. Okay, I'm hearing feedback from someone, and it's really... Does someone not have headphones on? Okay, it's better. Sorry.
I was checking the stream to make sure that everything was hunky-dory, but I thought I'd muted myself, and I didn't because...
Okay, I just want to make sure that we don't get an hour into this text that it just sits in the background for people that are listening. Yeah. Technology, too, seems to be at odds with itself. The bomb is pitted against the power reactor, the intercontinental missile against the communication satellite. The same technological discipline tends to appear both as foe and friend of humanity. And even traditionally human-oriented sciences, such as medicine, occupy an ambivalent position as a witness to the promise of advances in chemotherapy and the threat created by research in biological warfare. It is not surprising to find that the tension between promise and threat is increasingly being resolved in favor of threat by blanket rejection of technology. To an ever-growing extent, technology is viewed as a demon, imbued with a sinister life of its own that is likely to mechanize man if it fails to exterminate him. The deep pessimism this view produces is often as simplistic as the optimism that prevailed in earlier decades. There is a very real danger that we will lose our perspective towards technology, that we will neglect its liberatory tendencies, and worse, submit fatalistically to its use for destructive ends. If we are not to be paralyzed by this new form of social fatalism, a balance must be struck. The purpose of this article is to explore three questions. What is liberatory potential of modern technology, both material and spiritually? What tendencies, if any, are reshaping the machine for use in an organic, human-oriented society? And finally, how can the new technology and resources be used in an ecological manner? That is, to promote the balance of nature, the full development of natural regions, and the creation of organic, humanistic communities. The
Can
emphasis
I comment on that paragraph real quick?
Oh yeah, by all means.
So there's just a kind of like point of theoretical detail in that I wanted to bring to attention because it's pretty important for understanding Bookchin when he's writing about technology. So Bookchin mentions the machine in the last paragraph, and what I believe that's a reference to is that's a Lewis Mumford and a Mumfordian conception of tech. And basically what that is that's where technology isn't just like, a way to do something, but rather it refers to an entire ecosystem that includes not only the technology we produce, but also the social relations that exist. So it refers to an entire technological complex that includes tools, machines, utilities, skills, and its technology doesn't form an independent system. It only exists as a part of human culture.
Interesting. So in the way that Bookchin uses the term here, and I just wanted to note there was a little bit of digital interference there, so I'm not sure if maybe you're on a Wi-Fi connection or something, but I want to make sure we're able to catch all your words, so if it's possible to look into that. But I understood what you're saying. So when Bookchin's talking about technology, he's not just talking about the piece of technology itself, like this cell phone is technology. The technology is also the social relationships that mediate the production and distribution and use of that technology. So a cell phone doesn't sit alone. A cell phone is also connected to like the lithium mines, the global communications network, the hierarchical institutions that sell and make them, for example, like manufactured obsolescence, that sort of stuff. Is that sort of what Mumford and Bookchin getting at with this?
Yeah, and I posted a link to a little bit more about this in the book club chat too. But yeah, it refers to technology not as just like the pieces of technology but as a sort of a look at the entire ecosystem, including society and the piece of technology and how they interact, and viewing that as a whole, an entire thing.
Interesting. Aaron, do you want to pick up on the next page here?
Yeah, let me get going. So let's see.
The emphasis. Yep. Sorry.
Right. Okay. The emphasis in the above remarks should be placed on the word potential. I make no claim that technology is necessarily liberatory or consistently beneficial to man's development, but I surely do not believe that man is destined to be enslaved by technology and technological modes of thought, as Junger and Elu apply in their book on the subject. On the contrary, I shall try to show that an organic mode of life deprived of its technological component would be as non-functional as a man deprived of his skeleton. Technology must be viewed as the basic structural support of a society. It is literally the framework of an economy and of many social institutions. Technology and freedom. The year 1848 stands out as a turning point in the history of modern revolution. This was the year when Marxism made its debut as a distinct ideology in the pages of the Communist Manifesto, and when the proletariat, represented by the Parisian workers, made its debut as a distinct political force on the barricades of June. It could also be said that 1848, a year close to the halfway mark of the 19th century, represents the culmination of a traditional steam-powered technology initiated by the Newcomen engine a century and a half earlier.
What strikes us about the convergence of these ideological, political, and technological milestones is the extent to which the Communist Manifesto and the June barricades were in advance of their time. In the 1840s, the Industrial Revolution centered around three areas of the economy: textile production, iron making, and transportation. The invention of Arkwright's spinning machine, Watts's steam engine, and Cartwright's power loom had finally brought the factory system to the textile industry. Meanwhile, a number of striking innovations in iron-making technology assured the supply of a high-quality, inexpensive metals needed to sustain factory and railroad expansion. But these innovations, important as they were not accompanied by commensurate changes in other areas of industrial technology. For one thing, few steam engines were rated at more than 15 horsepower, and the best blast furnaces provided little more than 100 tons of iron a week, a fraction of the thousands of tons produced daily by modern furnaces. More important, the remaining areas of the economy were not yet significantly affected by technological innovation. Mining techniques, for example, had changed little since the days of the Renaissance. The miner still worked the ore face with a hand pick and a crowbar, and drainage pumps, ventilation systems, and hauling techniques were not greatly improved over the descriptions we find in Agricola's classic on mining, written 3 centuries earlier. Agriculture was only emerging from its centuries-old sleep. Although a great deal of land had been cleared for food cultivation, soil studies were still a novelty. So heavy, in fact, was the weight of tradition and conservatism that most harvesting was still done by hand, despite the fact that a mechanical reaper had been perfected as early as 1822. Buildings, despite their massiveness and ornateness, were erected primarily by sheer muscle power. The hand crane and windlass still occupied the mechanical center of the construction site. Steel was relatively rare metal. As late as 1850, it was priced at $250 a ton, and until the discovery of the Bessemer converter, steel-making techniques had stagnated for centuries. Finally, although precision tools had made great forward strides, it is worth noting that Charles Babbage's efforts to build a sophisticated mechanical computer were thwarted by the inadequate machining techniques of the time. Yeah, I think that might be a good place to stop, since the next thing gets cut off.
Yeah, do you want to pick it up, Steve? And I gotta say, this section of the book really reminds me of...
I'll put in and note that I'm not sure if these prices are adjusted for modern day, what the dollar's worth for inflation. But $250 a ton is just incredibly expensive for steel. If I was to scrap steel right now, it is pennies a ton. So it's kind of a huge deal.
See, that's really, really great context that I'm glad that you brought to this, NMAS. I have no idea what steel costs per ton. I said this on mute because I didn't realize I hadn't unmuted myself. But before we started talking, this part of the book really reminds me of the part of Capital, which I haven't read the entirety of, where he's talking about the different lengths of linens and the transfer of labor into linens and all this stuff, and he's getting into all this technical detail. It just it reminds me of that, in that this section has got this very very technical, not like in the technology sense, but in very detailed account of his view of the evolution of the mining technology. It's just a fascinating subcategory of radical writing where you're like, this is how this part of the economy works, and you give it 8 pages. Steve, do you want to pick up from? Do I sound better now, louder?
Oh, that's a lot better. That is just a lot better.
Okay, cool. So, thanks for the note, Aaron. I tweaked my audio settings here to be louder. Steve, do you want to pick up from, I've reviewed these technological developments for about a page, and you can hand it off?
Sure thing. I have reviewed these technological developments because their promise and their limitations exercised a profound influence on 19th century revolutionary thought. The innovations in textile and iron-making technology provided a new sense of promise, indeed a new stimulus to socialist and utopian. It seemed to the revolutionary theorists that for the first time they could anchor their dream of a liberatory in the visible prospect of material abundance and increased leisure for the mass of socialism. The theorists argued could be based on self-interest rather than on humans' dubious mind and spirit. Technological innovation had transmuted the socialist idea from a vague humanitarian hope into a practical.
Yeah, I'm gonna hop in here, Steve. We're losing some of your words, and from the connection, it sounds like a Wi-Fi Discord thing. But like your reading's awesome, and I want it to keep going. Is there a way that you can check your tech settings to see if we can like get closer, like get hardwired or something like that?
I can move closer to the router.
I think that would make a big difference because there was one of the so the visible prospect of material abundance and increased leisure for the mass of humanity, but humanity dropped, so it's like very at least it dropped on my end. Is it dropping for everyone?
Yeah, it's coming through pretty rough, which I mean this is live, so stuff like this is kind of expected. I mean, it does happen.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that we can hear you because I think your reading is great. Do you want to?
Am I coming through a little clearer now?
Yeah, maybe do you want to pick up where you were and we'll see how it is. I think being closer to the router will really help.
The newly acquired practicality compelled many social theorists, particularly Marx and Engels, to grapple with the technological limitations. They were faced with a strategic issue. In all previous revolutions, technology had not yet developed to a level where humans could be freed from material want, toil, and the struggle over the necessities of life. However glowing and lofty were the revolutionary ideals of the past, the vast majority of the people, burdened by material, had to leave the stage of history after the revolution, return to work, and deliver the management of society to a new leisured class of experts. Indeed, any attempt to equalize the wealth of a society at a low level of technological development would not have eliminated want, but would have merely made it into a general society as a whole, thereby recreating all the conditions for a new struggle for new forms of property and eventually for a new system of class domination. A development of the productive forces is the absolutely necessary practical premise of communism, wrote Marx and Engels in 1846, because without it, want is generalized, and with want, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced. Virtually all the utopias, theories, and revolutionary programs of the early 19th century were faced with problems of necessity: how to allocate labor and material goods at a relatively low level of technological development. These problems permeated revolutionary thought in a way comparable only to the impact of original sin on Christian theology. The fact that humans would have to devote a substantial portion of their time to toil, for which they would get scant returns, formed a major premise of all socialist ideology: authoritarian and libertarian, utopian and scientific, Marxist and anarchist. Implicit in the Marxist notion of a planned society was the incontestably clear in Marx that socialism would still be burdened by relatively scarce resources. Men would have to plan, in effect, to restrict the distribution of goods and would have to rationalize, in effect, to intensify the use of labor. Toil under socialism would be a duty, a responsibility which every able-bodied individual would have to take. even Proudhon advanced this dour view when he wrote, "Yes, life is a struggle, but this struggle is not between man and man. It is between man and nature, and it is each one's duty to..." This austere, almost biblical emphasis on struggle and duty reflects the harsh quality of socialist thought during the Industrial Revolution.
That's great, man. I think we'll get. There was a few. We unfortunately lost a few words there. It did sound better, and I want to compliment your reading. Very clear and awesome. And I want to. I've asked NMAS if he'll DM you about some of the Discord settings to see if we can close the gap and make sure that we get every word. But it was really, really great reading. And that time we only lost, I think, 2 words or so, 2 sentences where we had a little gap. And so that the one that I noticed, which I'll just fill in, is that let's see, is that Proudhon said it's the struggle between man and nature. It's everyone's duty to share it. It's every person's duty to share in this struggle against nature. So before we pass off to Rosa to do reading in the next section, actually I wanted to underline this concept that Proudhon and sort of like and Marxists are being sort of like grouped up here with, where the sort of idea of life as a struggle of man against nature, and if there was any thoughts on that from around the room. Because the emphasis on struggle and duty as something that's a commonality between both, capitalist workplace thought in the sort of like boss, the hierarchical dynamics of the workplace, that is also then replicated within socialist ideas, because it's the logic of society. I find that a really fascinating concept, that you could find that sort of like same underlying structure in both these
even
antagonistic ideologies.
Even in the previous section that we just read, they were talking about a bunch of technological innovations that were not adopted, despite being available much earlier. So it's interesting to see how the toil is initially a necessity and then becomes a value and just keeps being carried forward, and has an ethical dimension.
Yeah, like there could be don't give people laundry machines because there's something honest and good about washing all your clothes by hand. We need to toil in washing clothes by hand instead of having that be automated. Or it's a bizarre ideology.
This is not really to the point, but I can attest to the fact that washing your clothes by hand is not an ideologically good thing to do. They've closed all the laundromats in our area for COVID, so I have learned that lesson.
Well, I'm sorry that you have to deal with that. I really can't imagine having to. Oh man, this is some serious like technological being born in the turn of the millennium privilege, but having to wash my clothes by hand and my blankets and stuff, I would be just like, I'd be pretty choked, to say the least.
But I've started wearing things maybe more than I would usually, so that's, I guess less wasteful. I don't know.
I'm dirtier than I was before. I'm not sure.
It's a win. What? Don't judge.
It's more ecological.
Yes, exactly. Ecological.
Do you want to pick up where Steve finished
Sure.
off?
So we finished on Industrial Revolution, right?
I believe that is the case. Yes. So the problem of dealing with wanton work.
Yeah. The problem of dealing... Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Yeah, just as a note, when we stop, I'm trying to highlight the bit of the next sentence in the stream, so we kind of know where we left off.
Oh, nice. I'll check that next time.
So,
Okay.
as a note.
Thank you. The problem of dealing with wanton work, an age-old problem perpetuated by the early Industrial Revolution, produced the great divergence in revolutionary ideas between socialism and anarchism. Freedom would still be circumscribed by necessity in the event of a revolution. How was this world of necessity to be administered? In air quotes. How could the allocation of goods and duties be decided? Marx left this decision to a state power, a transitional proletarian state power, to be sure, but nevertheless a coercive body, established above society. According to Marx, the state would either wither away as technology developed and enlarge the domain of freedom, granting humanity material plenty and the leisure to control its affairs directly. This strange calculus, in which necessity and freedom were mediated by the state, differed very little politically from the common run of bourgeois democratic radical opinion in the last century. The anarchist hope for the abolition of the state, on the other hand, rested largely on a belief in the viability of humanity's social instincts. Bakunin, am I pronouncing that right?
I think so.
Bakunin, for example, thought custom would compel any individuals with antisocial proclivities to abide by collectivist values and needs without obliging society to use coercion. Kropotkin, I have in parentheses here bread Santa, which is making me happy, but I don't understand. You guys can explain later. Who exercised more influence among anarchists in this area of speculation, invoked man's propensity for mutual aid, essentially a socialist instinct, as a guarantor of solidarity in an anarchist community, a concept which he derived from his study of animal and social evolution.
Enmas, do you want to tell us just about Bread Santa briefly before continues?
I figure that I might add just a little bit of humor to the text to kind of break it up. So everyone calls Kropotkin Bread Santa because of the conquest of bread, and he kind of looks like Santa, or at least what
was the conquest of bread?
That's the anarcho-communist pretty much intro work, and it's really rather good. It's also up on the Anarchist Library if anyone wants to read it.
Cool, thanks for the reference.
Yeah, and so Kropotkin was for people who are less familiar with Kropotkin broadly, it's true he had a big beard and looked like Santa. And it's also true that one of his most famous works is often referred to colloquially as the bread book, because he's talking about because it's called The Conquest of Bread, and he uses bread as like a nexus to talk about a number of things around production and mutual aid. He's also the guy who popularized the political idea of mutual aid in his book Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. And he's broadly speaking like of the ecological anarchist tradition. I'd say that he's someone who is like a very direct influence on Bookchin's work. But yeah, if you want to pick up from where we were. Then.
Oh, cool, yeah. The fact remains, however, that in both cases, the Marxist and the anarchist, the answer to the problem of want and work was shot through with ambiguity. The realm of necessity was brutally present. It could not be conjured away by mere theory and speculation. The Marxists could hope to administer necessity by means of a state, and the anarchists to deal with it through free communities. But given the limited technological development of the last century, in the last analysis, both schools depended on an act of faith to cope with the problem of want and work. Anarchists could argue against the Marxists that any transitional state, however revolutionary its rhetoric and democratic in structure, would be self-perpetuating. It would tend to become an end in itself and to preserve the very material and social conditions it had been created to remove. For such a state to wither away, that is, to promote its own dissolution, would require its leaders and bureaucracy to be people of superhuman moral qualities. The Marxists, in turn, could invoke history to show that custom and mutualistic propensities, which is an innate inclination or tendency, were never effective barriers to the pressures of material need, or to the onslaught of property, or to the development of exploitation and class domination. Accordingly, they dismissed anarchism as an ethical doctrine, which revived the mystique of the natural humans and their inborn social virtues.
I want to touch on this idea of self-perpetuation in the context of a Marxist state, but also I think in a broader context, because I think this is an enormous pattern in politics, and it's something that we can see embodied in other things as well. So this anarchist critique of the sort of like Marxist state withering away idea that Bookchin's getting at here, that an organization will become a self-fulfilling or will become a self-interested organism in itself at a certain point. And so if you've been involved with a nonprofit organization, for example, or an activist group in the past, you might notice that they spend a lot of their time fundraising. They spend a lot of their time doing stuff that is related to the continued existence of the organization first and foremost. The organization gets its own sort of logic where it justifies its own existence and perpetuates its own existence ahead of even the original things that it would claim to do. So an example of a nonprofit organization that their job is to hand out food to the homeless or something like that. Well, if they have administrators that require salaries in order to do the stuff, then, well, first things first, the first thing we have to pay for is all the salaries, the office, etc. And then whatever we can fundraise on top of that is what's going to go towards feeding the homeless. So people in that position, it's not that they're individually unethical. It's that they, like Bookchin says, don't have superhuman moral qualities. So another example that's really good about this is you look at like social democratic governments running for re-election, where they run on high-minded sort of like social distributive ideas, taking care of people, etc. But to quote Bernie Sanders, and I do so to low-key dunk on him, although I love him, is there's this quote that's going around from Bernie Sanders. Actually, I don't know if it's true or not, which is that, when I was when I was an activist, I learned the importance of peace, and when I was mayor, I learned the importance of being reelected. So hopefully that's a real quote. I just realized I only saw it on a meme, so by some people trying to attack Bernie Sanders, so I'm just perpetuating it. But the idea there goes beyond Bernie. It goes to any politician. They want to be reelected first and foremost. They'll say things like, we're gonna make these little tweaks, but the best way, so if you're pushing politicians towards radical action, they'll be like, well, the best way to get what you want is let me really slowly do it and reelect me 8 times. So that's the same sort of pattern that Bookchin is highlighting here about these sort of like transitionary states. That is something that would need to be overcome in any sort of transition, is how do you create organizations that become first and foremost interested with perpetuating and expanding the values that they're founded on, in this case, full communism, first, rather than falling prey to these sort of innate tendencies towards self-perpetuation of the organization, and the organization taking on its own life where it begins to exist in a self-interested manner because of the competitive system that we're under. So I wanted to highlight that because I think it's just a really good point, and it applies to a lot of things, and it's something that we need to think through if we want to make radical political change in our lifetime, no matter how we identify as anarchist, Marxist, you name it. Do you want to finish off this page, Rosa?
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to say that that David Graeber book, Bullshit Jobs, is just like, if you haven't read it, and I mean, I know you have, but like people listening, might be a really nice illustration of organizations perpetuating themselves.
Yeah, that's an awesome example too, where he brings up examples of all these jobs that actually shouldn't exist. They're not actually very efficient. The companies could save money by cutting these sort of like middle management jobs where people sit at desks and work for an hour and a half a week. Out of 40 hours they're being paid. And there's a bunch of weird justifications for where they exist, but they become these self-perpetuating things. It's very much in the same spirit.
Cool. So I'm starting at the problem. The problem of wanton work, of the realm of necessity, was never satisfactorily resolved by either body of doctrine in the last century. It is to the lasting credit of anarchism that it uncompromisingly retained its high ideal of freedom, the ideal of spontaneous organization, community, and the abolition of all authority, although this ideal remained only a vision of humanity's future, of the time when technology would eliminate the realm of necessity entirely. Marxism increasingly compromised its ideal of freedom, painfully qualifying it with transitional stages and political expediencies. Until today, it is an ideology of naked power, pragmatic efficiency, and social centralization, almost indistinguishable from the ideologies of modern state capitalism. Ooh, sick burn. In retrospect, should I keep going?
Yeah, absolutely.
In retrospect, it is astonishing to consider how long the problem of want and work cast its shadow over revolutionary theory. In a span of only 9 decades, the years between 1850 and 1940, Western society created, passed through, and evolved beyond 2 major epochs of the technological history. The Paleotechnic age of coal and steel, and the Neotechnic stage of electric power, synthetic chemicals, electricity, and internal combustion engines. Ironically, both ages of technology seem to enhance the importance of toil in society. As the number of industrial workers increased in proportion to other social classes, labor, more precisely toil, acquired an increasingly high status in revolutionary thought. During this period, the propaganda of the socialists often sounded like a paean? What is that word?
I am not familiar with it.
Okay, as something to toil, a paean to toil. Not only.
It's a song of praise or triumph.
Okay, sounding like a song or praise of triumph to toil. Not only was toil ennobling, but the workers were extolled as the only useful individuals in the social fabric. Someone used their word of the day calendar. They were endowed with a supposedly superior instinctive ability that made them the arbiters of philosophy, art, and social organization. This puritanical, which is a strict moral or religious matter, often excessively so, this puritanical work ethic of the left did not diminish with the passage of time, and in fact acquired a certain urgency in the 1930s. Mass unemployment made the job and the social organization of labor the central themes of socialist propaganda in the 1930s. Instead of focusing their message on the emancipation of humans from toil, socialists tended to depict socialism as the beehive of industrial activity, humming with work for all. The communists pointed to Russia as a land where every able-bodied individual was employed and where labor was continually in demand. Surprising as it may seem today, little more than a generation ago, socialism was equated with a work-oriented society and liberty with the material security provided by full employment. The world of necessity had subtly invaded and corrupted the ideal of freedom.
Awesome. Let's pause here for a second because I think this is some heavy, really interesting stuff, and I was just wondering if anyone had thoughts they wanted to share on it.
Well, I think the Puritan work ethic, which he was trying to cover at least a little bit here, organizations like the IWW mentioned this a lot, especially perhaps maybe some of the Joe Hill songs that you may have heard, like Preacher and the Slave, the pie in the sky is a lie and what have you. But yeah, and this goes, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but if you work hard till you die, there will be, the gates of heaven will be open for you, kind of thing to it, especially in the U.S. here. I want to say I don't have experience elsewhere, but it's kind of the normal. I mean,
yeah, and it's interesting to imagine that sort of pie in the sky when you die concept of like, yeah, the that with the like the Christian work ethic, the Puritan work ethic, it's like you work hard your whole life and then you get to go to heaven, and then those sort of ideas exist in this like distorted form within the context of like the sort of Marxist adulation of work is sort of what Bookchin's saying here, that like it's you won't get a pie in the sky when you die, but you'll get a pie in the sky after the 5-year plan, or your children will get a pie in the sky if we all toil our whole lives building communism. And I think it's a really important contribution to this discussion from anarchist thought more broadly, is how we should treat work, and how what work exists for and what its ethical substance really is, and like work for work's sake versus, you know, productive work to help others. So something I want to highlight here before, and I'll pick up reading on this page and then we'll go to, we'll keep passing it off. The world of necessity and the ideal of freedom, these two ideas in contrast, and the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. I was wondering, Steve, would you be willing to pick up and talk a little bit about that distinction and how Bookchin thinks about it? Because I think it's an interesting piece. I guess not. So what I'll say is that, so these are Marxist conceptions, and I've heard Bookchin talk about this, is that there's the realm of necessity, which is the time that you spend getting what you absolutely need. And then there's the realm of freedom, where you have free time. So like the realm of necessity is your 8-hour workday, and the realm of freedom is the rest of the time. But then little bits of necessity sort of like creep into the realm of freedom. You know, you have to wash all your clothes by hand because it's COVID, or you have to, or just like, you know, do your dishes and stuff normally, you know, like there's work that comes with being alive apart from those 8 hours and the commute and everything. So the realm of necessity, like one of the issues with capitalist society is the realm of necessity pushing us further and further, taking away that realm of freedom, closing the window on how much time we have to be free, full human beings. And I think, as Marx would say, you know, be a fisherman, a critic, etc., you know, whatever you want to be in that time of freedom. Bookchin, I think in some of his later work, but I think along the lines of this, proposes first of all that the realm of necessity has been expanded over time, and that like primitive, like proto-humans had a lot more freedom comparatively. And we have evidence to suggest this, like that the average hunter-gatherer wouldn't work more than a few hours a day. But that also there's a potentiality to create a world where the realms of freedom and the realms of necessity are more interconnected, like a dialectical fusion, mutual destruction of both of them, and the like both destroying the realm of freedom and destroying the realm of necessity by merging them together and sublating them in a like which means to sublate is to both retain and destroy at the same time. It's a Hegelian term around dialectics. To mix them together to create something where, for example, not only do people have less toil in their lives, but that the toils that we do have to participate in, and I think a lot of anarchists, like even post-scarcity technological anarchists, will say, well, at the end of the day, we're all probably going to have to do some things we don't want to do, and we're going to have to figure out ways to distribute that. He suggests it's possible to create conditions that allow those moments of necessity to be, in a sense, realms of freedom also, to have them mixed together, to have work be a joyous thing when you do it. When you have to mow your lawn, that it's not something that's a chore that you hate, it's a part of the vibrancy of your life, and you never are forced to do it in a way that is dehumanizing and hierarchical and etc.
Can I add like a feminist perspective to that as well?
Absolutely.
So there's a really great book called Invisible Women, which is about the way women aren't measured by conventional metrics, and often how their labor isn't measured. And so one of the things the book explores is how across the globe women work multiple hours, depending where it changes. It's between like 4 and 1 hour a day more than men if you count domestic labor. So I think that's really interesting, and especially if you like go and look at like Marxist texts, they often don't quite address that issue, or don't really like resolve that tension, where you have a lot of like labor is really stratified into this thing that you go to work and do, and you get compensated for your hours. But there's this whole other sphere of work that is happening in a sort of under-theorized space.
I think that it's an interesting thing to think about historically. I mean, and now to a great degree, but also to a more extreme degree in the recent past, that women across the board were deprived to a higher degree of the realm of freedom. That like that there was a it's really fucked up to think about that and I think that's also a thing that distinguishes well social ecology and Marxist schools of thought. And it's not that there isn't good Marxist feminism and stuff. There's not great feminist Marxists and stuff, but that Marxism at its starting point wasn't designed to address these type of issues. You can adapt to it, you can add things to it, and you can develop it successfully. But social ecology explicitly sort of at its foundation was how do we find the commonality between all of these struggles? How do we expand explicitly from first principles, from workers versus bosses or workers versus capital owners, to a framework that we can address all these different pieces. And that's where the sort of critique of hierarchy, the anarchist critique of hierarchy being synthesized, comes in.
Yeah, that's very attractive about the text.
I think this is also something too that frankly still needs more development within social ecological frameworks. I know there's the ISE just launched a new zine where people are contributing discussion on some of these things, but a lot of the it's hard to find. There's not enough new social ecological writing, so I think this is something that we should really, as a group of people who are interested in this sort of stuff, to think about this as a place where we can not just receive good ideas, but we can continue to take those good ideas and interplay them with other ideas and stuff. And unfortunately, honestly, I just haven't seen enough discussions of that within, because a lot of these texts, like this text, is from still using the universal man and etc. But the potentiality, and like it's explicit, but also really explicitly the potentiality is there in the design of the structure, like in the structure of the analysis. The idea of hierarchy can address that sort of like domestic labor issue, I think, in a lot better way than, I guess you could sort of approximate, okay, well, like women are workers, and in a sense, like, men are like a type of capital owner, and that they're able to collect rent from women's labor by their presence or something like that. Like you could use that Marxist framework, I guess. Like you could try to stretch it, but yeah. Okay, I'm gonna pick up where we were. Were we at the socialist notions?
Yes.
Sweet. That the socialist notions of the last generation now seem to be anachronisms is not due to any superior insights that prevail today. In the last 3 decades, particularly the years of the late 1950s, mark a turning point in technological development, a technological revolution that negates all the values, political schemes, and social perspectives held by mankind throughout all previous recorded history. After thousands of years of torturous development, the countries of the Western world, and potentially all countries, are confronted by the possibility of a materially abundant, almost workless era, which most of the means of life can be provided by machines. As we shall see, a new technology has developed that could largely replace the realm of necessity by the realm of freedom. So obvious is this fact to millions of people in the United States and Europe that it no longer requires elaborate explanations or theoretical exegesis, which has been helpfully defined here by NMAS, because what the hell word is that? Critical explanation or interpretation. It no longer requires elaborate explanations or theoretical critical explanations. But yeah, it's funny how many long words that Bookchin uses that are just not necessary, but interesting. Or sometimes it carries more depth. I shouldn't shit on it. This technological revolution and the prospects it holds for society as a whole form the premises of a radically new lifestyle among today's young people, a generation that is rapidly divesting itself from the values and the age-old work-oriented traditions of its elders. Even recent demands for a guaranteed annual income sound like faint echoes of the new reality that currently permeates the thinking of the young. Owing to the development of a cybernetic technology, the notion of a toilless mode of life has become an article of faith to an ever-increasing number of young people. On the subject of universal basic income in the 1950s, this is something that was promoted by Martin Luther King, and it was something that, of all people, President Nixon came close to doing. You can look up the history of President Nixon and basic income. I can't remember the details, but it ended up not happening after getting moving quite far along the process as a program. I think through either the Senate or the Congress at first. In fact, the real issue we face today is not whether this new technology can provide us with the means of life in a toilless society, but whether it can help to humanize society, whether it can contribute to the creation of entirely new relationships between man and man, whether it can contribute to the creation of entirely new relationships between humankind. The demand for a guaranteed annual income is still anchored in the quantitative promise of technology, in the possibility of satisfying material needs without toil. This quantitative approach is already lagging behind technological developments that carry a new qualitative promise. So quantitative means amount, qualitative means type. So a quantity of rice would be 1,000 rice. A quality of rice would be whole, I don't know the different types, jasmine or white rice. Already lagging behind the technological developments that carry a new qualitative promise, the promise of a decentralized communitarian lifestyle, or what I prefer to call ecological forms of human association. I'm asking a question that is quite different from what is ordinarily posed with respect to modern technology. Is this technology staking out a new dimension in human freedom and the liberation of man? Can it not only liberate man from want and work? God damn. Is this
I missed a bunch. Sorry.
No, it's nobody's fault. It's Is this technology staking out an? I think like putting any work into editing the text is already above and beyond. Is this technology staking out a new dimension in human freedom, in the liberation of humanity? It sounds better too. Like it just feels deeper. It's deeper felt when you talk about humanity to me than when you talk about the humanity metaphor through the word man. Can it not only liberate humanity from want and work, but also lead us to a free, harmonious, balanced human community, an eco-community that would promote the unrestricted development of our potentialities? Finally, can it carry humanity beyond the realm of freedom into the realm of life and desire? That's an interesting question. Beyond the realm of freedom. What would beyond the realm of freedom be? If the realm of freedom is the part of the day where you don't have to work, what would be more than the realm of freedom? And I think this is what he's getting at. The realm of freedom is the preconditions of living your life. It's the preconditions of developing ourselves. It's the preconditions of truly achieving human potential. And so we can start with the point of, okay, universal basic income, shortening the workday, and et cetera, like that. That's expanding the realm of freedom, which gives us this developmental potential. But the ultimate goal of social ecology, and I think all leftist sort of radical movements throughout history, universal human emancipation movements is to create a realm that goes beyond just the realm of not having to work, but the realm of living vivid, complete lives that are deeply felt, and that are where humanity experiences the full potential of the human experience and achieves the what we're all capable of. We all have the capacity to thrive if we're given that context. So I really, really powerfully love that sentence. So, is it Roosh? Would you like to pick up from Roche? Roche, would you like to pick up from potentialities of modern technology? Oh, Aaron says here in the chat that Nixon gave up on UBI after there was a study saying women would divorce their husbands at higher rates if UBI was adopted.
Yeah, that was specifically the book Utopia for Realists by Rucker Bregman, who's like one of the guys who one of the big international conventions. He's the guy he was like, we're not talking about taxes. He was sitting in a bunch of like CEOs and stuff, and nobody wanted to talk about taxes, and he went viral for that reason. But that was in that book, and he also talked about Canada, so it may have been the one in Canada, but if I'm remembering correctly, and people can look in that book, but that was where I've gotten that information. So yeah, just wanted to give a source for that.
Yeah, and that basic. Oh, sorry, go on.
I just real quick, because I've been linking all the books in the discussion here that have been brought up. Oh, there it is. I'm done. It's linked. So that was my question. Was the name of the book again? So I can Google it.
Utopia for Realists, and I think I will recommend this book heavily, especially in specifically the context of if you know people who are sort of interested in, say like center left to left politics broadly, but that you don't think are going to get really deep down in like historical stuff or theoretical stuff. It's sort of like a pop utopian book, and it's not perfect, but I think it's a really, really great gift for like a family member, and I think most people who read it will really get something from it. I really got something from it. Although I wouldn't read it if you're easily agitated by things not being radical enough, because he goes really far to like try to make this stuff centrist and palatable for your dad or whatever. Maybe Nmas, do you want to pick up where we were, and we'll get Rosh in the next one, or are you ready now, Rosh?
I'm happy to jump in if y'all can hear me.
Oh yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'm loading. Nmas, your screen share isn't loading up for me, but I do have a PDF of this that I can read from, if that's okay with y'all.
I linked the edited one above in the chat. I've also just been kind of editing it live. I did the classic thing where I was an English teacher for a day, so I got quite inebriated when I was editing.
Got you. Okay, I see. Let's see here. Yeah, I think I know where we are.
Yeah, I'm trying to save my next bit of reading for a couple pages from now. I'm going to go off on probably a rant and a story, which would be a good time for everyone to grab a cup of coffee or some tea, what have you.
The potentialities of modern technology, correct? Is that where we are?
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, so I'm reading from my PDF right at this second. So if I do any of that universal man thing, just let me know. Let me try to answer these questions by pointing to a new feature of modern technology. For the first time in history, technology has reached an open end. The potential for technological development for providing machines as substitutes for labor is virtually unlimited. Technology has finally passed from the realm of invention to that of design-in. In other words, from fortuitous discoveries to systematic innovations. The meaning of this qualitative advance has been stated in a rather freewheeling way by Vannevar Bush, the former director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. block quote. Suppose 50 years ago that someone had proposed making a device which would cause an automobile to follow a white line down the middle of the road, automatically, and even if the driver fell asleep. He would have been laughed at, they would have been laughed at, and their idea would have been called preposterous. So it would have been then. But suppose someone called for such a device today and was willing to pay for it, leaving aside the question of whether it would actually be of any genuine use whatever. Any number of concerns would stand ready to contract and build it. No real invention would be required. There are thousands of young men, possibly women and others, in this country to whom the design of such a device would be a pleasure. They would simply take off the shelf some photocells, thermionic tubes, servo mechanisms, relays, and, if urged, they would build what they call a breadboard model, and it would work. Leaving aside the point is that the presence of a host of versatile, cheap, reliable gadgets and the presence of people who understand fully all their queer ways has rendered the building of automatic devices almost straightforward and routine. It is no longer a question of whether they can be built, it is rather a question of whether they are worth building. Bush focuses here on the two most important features of the new so-called Second Industrial Revolution, namely the enormous potentialities of modern technology and the cost-oriented, non-human limitations that are imposed upon it. I shall not belabor the fact that the cost factor, the profit motive, to state it bluntly, inhibits the use of technological innovations. It is fairly well established that in many areas of the economy, it is cheaper to use labor than machines. Instead, I would like to review several developments which have brought us to an open end in technology and deal with a number of practical applications that have profoundly affected the role of labor in industry and agriculture.
I want to highlight something here on it being cheaper to use labor than machines. This point is, I think, really, really important. Something I got from Richard Wolff, the Marxist economist, was that, a lot of times in capitalist and market dynamics, they'll talk about efficiency. But what they always mean is economic efficiency. But economic efficiency can come at the cost of other types of efficiencies. So, for example, it might be more efficient to use a more polluting gas than a less polluting fuel economically. But that's very inefficient when it comes to the environment, and especially if it can be even economically inefficient if you look at externalities. We have to get this stuff out of the atmosphere later. So in this dichotomy that Bookchin's drawn here is that in areas of the economy, even though there's an inherent liberatory good of having people do less toil and still being able to live their lives, and technology gives us the capacity to do that, the market dynamics call it efficient to force people to work because it's cheaper to basically burn through human stock by overworking people than it is to use the technology that could liberate them. And I think this is a crucial sort of distinction and really important. So if anyone has comments on that, feel free to jump in, and then otherwise we can just go back to Rush.
So I just linked in the chat here an article about Toyota switching from robots back to humans because it's more efficient for them. So this is actually happening. And I'd like to comment at least a little bit on the block quote that was above that was terribly edited. Sorry. That a lot of this is covered in the new maker movement that we see. He mentions breadboards, photocells, all that, relays. If you have access to something like an Arduino nowadays, people in the 60s would just have their mind blown by such a piece of technology. Because that's pretty much just a little PLC that's $25 that you can do a lot with. I'm not going to go into it. You can Google it, but it's just amazing what people do with such a simple tool these days.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the maker movement and the sort of like 3D printers and that sort of stuff is being sort of foreshadowed here in this text.
Man, but one of my rants was going to be 3D printing. You just ruined the surprise.
Sorry. Spoiler
alert. It's fine. It's fine. Because he talks mostly about manufacturing in a subtractive sense, which will be covered a little bit more, I think, in the next few pages. But none of it's covered in the additive sense because that technology didn't exist at the time. So it's something to keep in mind about trying to modernize what Bookchin's talking about.
Do you want to pick up, Rosh?
Sure. Perhaps the most obvious development leading to the new technology has been the increasing interpenetration or permeation of scientific abstraction, mathematics, and analytic methods with the concrete, pragmatic, and rather mundane tasks of industry. This order of relationships is relatively new. Traditionally, speculation, generalization, and rational activity were sharply divorced from technology. This chasm reflected the sharp split between the leisured and working classes in ancient and medieval society. If one leaves aside the inspired works of a few rare humans, applied science does not come into its own until the Renaissance, and it only began to flourish in the 18th and 19th centuries. The people who personify the application of science to technological innovation are not the inventive tinkerers like Edison, but the systematic investigators with Catholic interests like Faraday, who add simultaneously to humankind's knowledge of scientific principles and to engineering. In our own day, this synthesis, once embodied by the work of a single inspired genius, is the work of anonymous teams. Although these teams have obvious advantages, they often have all the traits of bureaucratic agencies, which leads them to a mediocre, unimaginative treatment of problems. Less obvious is the impact produced by industrial growth. This impact is not always technological. It is more than the substitution of machines for human labor. One of the most effective means of increasing output, in fact, has been the continual reorganization of the labor process, extending and sophisticating the division of labor. Ironically, the steady breakdown of tasks to ever more inhuman dimensions, to an intolerably minute, fragmented series of operations, and to a cruel simplification of the work process, suggests the machine that will recombine all the separate tasks of many workers into a single mechanized operation. Historically, it would be difficult to understand how mechanized mass manufacture emerged, how the machine increasingly displaced labor, without tracing the development of the work process from... Can you scroll a little bit? Sorry, I got lost there. I'm looking over between windows. And try to catch up.
Yeah, and I must note, I didn't know if I should be changing craftsmanship to craftsperson. Like, it's one of those weird words that kind of only works with a gender in it, I think.
Yeah. I guess like crafting, like if I were to redesign the language, you don't really need the reference to humanity in there. It could just be craftship. But I don't know that that's not a real word, so we can't use it.
Yeah, I didn't want people to be confused, but it took me like a half hour to realize that I'm just going to leave it.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't go too far because I know Justin Trudeau really got dunked on for substituting a person into something once, and I want to avoid criticism from that side too.
Well, and that's also why there's strike throughs, and I'm not just straight up replacing stuff, so you can actually see what was there originally too. So,
do y'all want me to keep going?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Finish off the page.
Sure. Nmas, could you scroll down a little bit?
Well, I think
or maybe you did, and I just haven't caught up.
I mean, you could start back at historically.
Yes. Okay. Historically, it would be difficult to understand how mechanized mass manufacture emerged, how the machine increasingly displaced labor, without tracing the development of work process from craftspersonship, where the independent, highly skilled worker engages in many diverse operations through the purgatory of the factory, where these diverse tasks are parceled out among a multitude of unskilled or semi-skilled employees to the highly mechanized mill, where the tasks of many are largely taken over by machines manipulated by a few operatives, and finally to the automated and cybernated plant, where operatives are replaced by supervisory technicians and highly skilled maintenance men, or people, maintenance. Looking further into the matter, we find still another new development. The machine has evolved from an extension of human muscles to an extension of the human nervous system. In the past, both tools and machines enhanced humanity's muscular power over raw materials and natural forces. The mechanical devices and engines developed during the 18th and 19th centuries did not replace human muscles, but rather enlarged their effectiveness. Although the machines increased output enormously, the workers' muscles and brains were still required to operate them, even for fairly routine use. The calculus of technological advance could be formulated in strict terms of labor productivity. One person being given a machine produced as many commodities as 5, 10, 50, or 100 before the machine was employed. Naismith's steam hammer, exhibited in 1851, could shape iron beams with only a few blows, an effort that would have required many man-hours or people-hours of labor without the machine. But the hammer required the muscles and judgment of half a dozen able-bodied men to pull, hold, and remove the casting. In time, much of this work was diminished by the invention of handling devices, but the labor and judgment involved in operating the machines formed an indispensable part of the productive process.
I just want to say I love that we're trying to keep track of this stuff in the document in terms of stuff like man hours, because it just draws so much attention to it, and it's so jarring in this context of like, why ever say man hours when it's an hour of labor is an hour of labor? Like, what is it?
Yep.
How does it have to do with anything? Like, why shape language that way? We got a new guest who offered to do a reading, and I was thinking I would hand it off to him if he's ready. James, are you ready to pick up?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. I've got the 1986 version. I don't have the collective text, but I can read from. It's the same text, I guess. I just haven't got the collective link yet. So the development of fully automatic machines for complex mass manufacturing operations requires the successful application of at least 3 technological principles. Such machines must have built-in ability to correct their own errors. They must have sensory devices for replacing the visual, auditory, and tactile senses of the worker. And finally, they must have devices that substitute for the worker's judgment, skill, and memory. The effective use of these 3 principles presupposes that we have also developed the technological means, the effectors, if you will, for applying the sensory, control, and mind-like devices in everyday industrial operation. Further, effective use presupposes that we can adapt existing machines or develop new ones for handling, shaping, assembling, packaging, and transporting semi-finished and finished products. Are the levels okay, by the way?
Yeah, great.
They sound great.
I continue?
Yeah, absolutely.
The use of automatic self-correcting control devices in industrial operations is not new. James Watt's flyball governor, invented in 1788, provides an early mechanical example of how steam engines were self-regulated. The governor, which is attached by metal arms to the engine valve, consists of 2 freely mounted metal balls supported by a thin, rotating rod. If the engine begins to operate too rapidly, the increased rotation of the rod impels the ball outwards by centrifugal force, closing the valve. Conversely, if the valve does not emit sufficient steam to operate the engine at the desired rate, the ball collapses inward, opening the valve further. A similar principle is involved in the operation of thermostatically controlled heating equipment. The thermostat, manually preset by a dial to a desired temperature level, automatically starts up heating equipment when the temperature and turns off the equipment when the temperature rises. Okay?
Yeah, you can keep going if you'd like.
It's happy for me to. Okay. Both control devices illustrate what is now called the feedback principle. In modern electronic equipment, the deviation of a machine from a desired level of operation produces electrical signals, which are then used by the control device to correct the deviation or error. The electrical signals induced by the error are amplified and fed back by the control system to other devices, which adjust the machine. A control system in which a departure from the norm is actually just used to adjust a machine is called a closed system. This may be contrasted with an open system. A manually operated wall switch, or the arms that automatically rotate an electrical fan, in which the control operates without regard to the function of the device. Thus, if a wall switch is flicked, electric lights go on or off, whether it is night or day. Similarly, an electric fan will rotate at the same speed whether the room is warm or cool. The fan may be automatic in the popular sense of the term, but it's not self-regulating, like the flyball governor or the thermostat. An important step towards developing self-regulating control mechanisms was the bear with me, sorry, one sec.
That's fine.
An important step towards developing self-regulating control mechanisms was the discovery of sensory devices. Today, these include thermocouples, photoelectric cells, X-ray machines, television cameras, and radar transmitters. Used together or singly, they provide machines with an amazing degree of autonomy. Even without computers, these sensory devices make it possible for workers to engage in extremely hazardous operations by remote control. They can also be used to turn many traditional open systems into closed ones, thereby expanding the scope of automatic operations. For example, an electric light controlled by a clock represents a fairly simple open system. Its effectiveness depends entirely upon mechanical factors. Regulated by a photoelectric cell that turns it off when daylight approaches, the light responds to daily variations in sunrise and sunset. Its operation is now meshed with its function. Shall I go on, or should we chat a bit about those passages?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah, and you said in the chat this is.
Well, I'd like to point out that in modern times, and this just became a thing right around actually the time that this was written in 1965. This came out. A lot of what he's talking about, and you can look it up, is now used. Instead of just having sensors with relays and what have you, a lot of it's done via computer control with a simple PLC, which is a programmable logic controller. So you can have all these inputs control all these outputs in real time, and it's pretty much what all automation runs on these days. And going back to the Arduino thing, that's pretty much what an Arduino is. Granted, an Arduino is programmed a little differently, but the fact that it's available to the people now, it's not just a piece of expensive industrial equipment, is quite liberating, especially for people that participate in such movements like the Maker movement, where they're doing a lot of cool stuff with this availability of a product such as that.
And James, you had said in the chat that this is one of your favorite books.
Yeah.
Is this chapter in particular one of it, or just more broadly post-scarcity anarchism?
Yes, if you're happy for me to just very briefly explain what I meant by that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Specifically, this chapter is one of the most influential. I mean, I love the entire book, but this chapter in particular has been hugely influential on me. I'm currently doing my PhD thesis about exactly this stuff, and Bookchin's this specific, because originally it was an essay. Obviously, post-scarcity anarchism is really an essay collection, and this specific one is really influential to me. This stuff about the problem of want and work, I think it's really kind of my whole focus. I'm very interested in full automation and post-scarcity, and Bookchin was kind of my way into that. So when I saw that you were doing the book group on this chapter on Twitter, I had to jump in and become a patron and join the Discord and all the rest of it. So here I am. Thanks for having me on. Sorry for bursting in halfway through.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, and actually on that note, if there's anything that relates to say like research that you've done and stuff like that, where you have a perspective that you can share on the text, generally I'd encourage that. I think we'd all appreciate. And the people listening too, to just get more context. For example, NMAS taught us earlier what the regular price of steel per pound is, and how, which provided some very useful context to a passage that I would have otherwise not understood. So along those lines, really, I appreciate you coming out and sharing your thoughts as we go forward. NMAS is the part that you want to read next fairly far off? Should we put someone else before you?
I'm in no hurry. I should turn down my monitors. I'm in no hurry. If you want to keep just passing it around, this is actually kind of cool to see.
Yeah.
I'm also really enjoying our people dropping in and stuff, and just having more voices. I think it's going to make the text really pop for people and help learn the things in this text that are like really study and understand it. Aaron, do you want to pick up from where James left off?
Yeah, I can do that, because I was about to say too. I may need to hop off here in a little bit, so I can do a little bit more reading before I do that. So that works out perfectly, actually. With the advent of the computer, that's where we're at, right?
Yeah,
that's where I'm at. Yeah, I'll hand over to you then.
Okay. Yeah. With the advent of the computer, we enter an entirely new dimension of industrial control systems. The computer is capable of performing all the routine tasks that ordinarily burden the mind of the worker a generation or so ago. Basically, the modern digital computer is an electronic calculator capable of performing arithmetical operations enormously faster than the human brain. This element, that line proves it. Anyways, this element of speed is a crucial factor. The enormous rapidity of computer operations, a quantitative superiority of computer over human calculations, has profound qualitative significance. By virtue of its speed, the computer can perform highly sophisticated mathematical and logical operations. Supported by memory units that store millions of bits of information and using binary arithmetic, the substitution of the digits 0 and 1 for the digits 0 through 9, a properly programmed digital computer can perform operations that approximate many highly developed logical activities of the mind. It is arguable whether computer intelligence, in quotes, is or ever will be creative or innovative, although every few years brings sweeping changes in computer technology. But there is no doubt that the digital computer is capable of taking over all the onerous and distinctly uncreative mental tasks of humans in industry, science, engineering, information retrieval, and transportation. Modern humans, in effect, have produced an electronic mind, in quotes, for coordinating, building, and evaluating most of their routine industrial operations. Properly used within the sphere of competence for which they are designed, computers are faster and more efficient than man himself. What is the concrete significance of this new industrial revolution? What are its immediate and foreseeable implications for work? Let us trace the impact of the new technology on the work process by examining its application to the manufacture of automobile engines at the Ford plant in Cleveland. This single instance of technological sophistication will help us assess the liberatory potential of the new technology in all manufacturing industries. Until the advent of cybernation in the automobile industry, the Ford plant required about 300 workers, using a large variety of tools and machines to turn an engine block into an engine. The process from foundry casting to a fully machined engine took many hours to perform. The development of what we commonly call an automated machine system, the time required to transform the casting into an engine was reduced to less than 15 minutes. Aside from a few monitors to watch the automatic control panels, The original 300-person labor force was eliminated. Later, a computer was added to the machining system, turning it into a truly closed cybernated system. The computer regulates the entire machining process, operating on an electronic pulse that cycles at a rate of 0.3 of a millionth of a second. But even this system is obsolete. The next generation of computing machines operates 1,000 times as fast, at a pulse rate of 1 in every 0.3 of a billionth of a second, observes Alice Mary Hilton. That last part was in quotes, and this next part is as well. Quotes. Speeds of millionths and billionths of a second are not really intelligible to our finite minds, but we can certainly understand that the advance has been 1,000-fold within a year or two. 1,000 times as much information can be handled, or the same amount of information can be handled 1,000 times as fast. A job that takes more than 16 hours can be done in 1 minute, and without any human intervention. Such a system does not control merely an assembly line, but a complete manufacturing and industrial process. End quote. There is no reason why the basic technological principles involved in cybernating the manufacture of automobile engines cannot be applied to virtually every area of mass manufacture. From the metallurgical industry to the food processing industry, from the electronics industry to the toy-making industry, from the manufacture of prefabricated bridges to the manufacture of prefabricated houses. Many phases of steel production, tool and die making, electronic equipment manufacture, and industrial chemical production are now partly or largely automated. What tends to delay the advance of complete automation to every phase of modern industry is the enormous cost involved in replacing existing industrial facilities by new, more sophisticated ones, and also the innate conservatism of many major corporations. Finally, as I mentioned before, it is still cheaper to use labor instead of machines in many industries. To be sure, every industry has its own particular problems, and the application of a toilless technology to a specific plant would doubtless reveal a multitude of kinks that would require painstaking solutions. In many industries, it would be necessary to alter the shape of the product and the layout of the plant so that the manufacturing process would lend itself to automated techniques. But to argue from these problems that the application of a fully automated technology to a specific industry is impossible would be preposterous, as to have argued 80 years ago that flight was impossible because the propeller of an experimental airplane did not revolve fast enough or the frame was too fragile to withstand buffeting by the wind. There is practically no industry that cannot be fully automated if we are willing to redesign the product, the plant, the manufacturing procedures, and the handling methods. In fact, any difficulty in describing how, where, or when a given industry will be automated arises not from the unique problems we can expect to encounter, but rather from the enormous leaps that occur every few years in modern technology. Almost every account of applied automation today must be regarded as provisional. As soon as one describes a partially automated industry, technological advances make the description obsolete. And
that was great.
Yeah, do we want to discuss there, or y'all want me to keep going, or what?
I wanted to ask James in particular, because you're pretty deep in this.
Also, there is a lot going on in these few paragraphs, and a lot of this has to do with manufacturing engineering, specifically to a lot of specialized shops that make just a certain product are actually specialized to the point to where they buy machines just to make said product. And it is a very expensive expenditure to do, and it's only ever gotten cheaper in the modern time, which is kind of like the summary of what's going on here.
I wanted to ask James, because you're doing your PhD on this sort of stuff, about this section specifically in terms of like the potentialities of automation. When Bookchin says, for example, we can automate literally everything. I was wondering if you had a perspective on that was sort of informed by maybe like a more modern perspective on this and how it reflects with what Bookchin's saying.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, to me, one of the remarkable things about this text in particular is for how early he's writing, how he does actually anticipate, where he talks about how the how and the why, the sort of nitty gritty of automation is regarded as provisional. He's foreseeing a future in which obviously a lot of us live, where what he says here has been totally vindicated. So one particular interesting thing, obviously here he's talking specifically about physical manufacturing, but in the previous section he was talking about electronic computing and kind of trying to anticipate that not just manual tasks, but actually intellectual tasks will be automatable. And of course, what's happened in the intervening time is with the advent of things like machine learning, the sort of computing power, the computing techniques that he anticipates have largely come into being. So he was quite right in predicting that. There's a passage, I think he says, where he says, modern man, in effect, has produced an electronic mind for coordinating, building, and evaluating routines and operations. I mean, we've now got to a point where we're much closer to the total automation of any conceivable task than even we were at this point. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. No, I think in really good context for what's talking about here. I wanted to, I was going to ask Rosa if you wanted to pick up the reading, but before we move on, any more thoughts on this section that anyone wants to hop in with? Cool. You ready to go, Rosa, to pick up where we're at? I think it is, there's one area of the economy.
Give me 1 second.
I'm actually going to hop off real quick before she starts. But sorry to have to leave halfway through.
Yeah, no worries. Well, yeah, thanks a lot for.
There we.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your help today, Aaron. And we'll see you around.
Yep. No, it's been fun. I'll hopefully I can join in next time too.
Cool. Yeah. See you later.
All right. Good luck.
Bye. Okay, we ready?
Absolutely, lay it on us.
Lovely, yay! There is one area of the economy, however, in which any form of technological advance is worth describing, the area of work that is most brutalizing and degrading for humans. If it is true that the moral level of a society can be gauged by the way it treats women, there we go, its sensitivity to human suffering can be gauged by the working conditions it provides for people in raw material industries, particularly in mines and quarries. In the ancient world, mining was often a form of penal servitude, reserved primarily for the most hardened criminals, the most intractable slaves, and the most hated prisoners of war. The mine is the day-to-day actualization of man's image of hell. It is a deadening, dismal, inorganic world that demands pure, mindless toil. And I think this next bit is a quote. Field, forest, and stream and ocean are the environments of life. The mine is the environment alone of ores, minerals, and metals, writes Lewis Mumford. In hacking and digging the contents of the earth, the miner has no eye for the forms of things. What he sees is sheer matter, and until he gets to his vein, it is only an obstacle which he breaks through stubbornly and sends up to the surface. If the miner sees shapes on the wall of his cavern as the candle flickers, they are only the monstrous distortions of their pick or their arm, shapes of fear. Day has been abolished and the rhythm of nature broken. Continuous day and night production first came into existence here. The miner must work by artificial light, even though the sun be shining outside, still further down in the seams. They must work by artificial ventilation, too, a triumph of the manufactured environment. End quote. The abolition of mining as a sphere of human activity would symbolize, in its own way, the triumph of a liberatory technology. That we can point to this achievement already even in a single case at this writing, presages the freedom from toil implicit in the technology of our time. The first major step in this direction was the continuous miner, a giant cutting machine with 9-foot blades that slices up 8 tons of coal a minute from the coal face. It was this machine, together with mobile loading machines, power drills, and roof bolting, that reduced mine employment in areas like West Virginia to about a third of the 1948 levels. At the same time, nearly doubling individual output. The coal mine still required miners to place and operate the machines. The most recent technological advances, however, replace the operators by radar sensing devices and eliminate the miner completely. By adding sensing devices to automatic machinery, we could easily remove the worker not only from the large productive mines needed by the economy, but also from forms of agricultural activity patterned on modern industry. Although the wisdom of industrializing and mechanizing agriculture is highly questionable, I shall return to this subject at a later point, the fact remains that if society so chooses, it can automate large areas of industrial agriculture, ranging from cotton picking to rice harvesting. We could operate almost any machine, from a giant shovel in an open strip mine to a grain harvester in the Great Plains, either by cybernated sensing devices or by remote control with television cameras. The effort needed to operate these devices and machines at a safe distance, in comfortable quarters, would be minimal, assuming that a human operator were required at all. It is easy to foresee a time, by no means remote, when a rationally organized economy could automatically manufacture small, packaged factories without human labor. Parts could be produced with so little effort that most of the maintenance tasks would be reduced to the simple act of removing a defective unit from a machine and replacing it by another. A job no more difficult than pulling out and putting in a tray. Machines would make and repair most of the machines required to maintain such a highly industrialized economy. Such a technology, oriented entirely towards human needs and freed from all the consideration of profit and loss, would eliminate the pain of wanton toil, the penalty inflicted in the form of denial, suffering, and inhumanity extracted by a society based on scarcity and labor. The possibilities created by a cybernated technology would no longer be limited merely to the satisfaction of humanity's material needs. We would be free to ask how the machine, the factory, and the mine could be used to foster human solidarity and to create a balanced relationship with nature and a truly organic eco-community. Yes, eco-community. Would our new technology be based on the same national division of labor that exists today? The current type of industrial organization, an extension in effect of the industrial forms created by the Industrial Revolution, fosters industrial centralization, although a system of workers' management based on the individual factory and local community would go far towards eliminating this feature. Sorry, my chair's kind of creaky. Or does the new technology lend itself to a system of small-scale production based on a regional economy and structured physically on a human scale? This type of industrial organization places all economic decisions in the hands of the local community. To the degree that material production is decentralized and localized, the primacy of the community is asserted over national institutions, assuming that any such national institutions develop to a significant extent. In these circumstances, the popular assembly of the local community, convened in a face-to-face democracy, takes over the full management of social life. The question is whether a future society will be organized around technology, or whether technology is now sufficiently malleable so that it can be organized around society. To answer this question, we must further examine certain features of the new technology.
That was
and
great.
I'll pause here.
Yeah, in this next section, it's very sort of technical. I was gonna hand off to, or it makes my eyes glaze over more than other parts of the text. So I feel bad to hand it off to someone. And I think if possible, I was gonna ask if you feel up for tackling this Rosh, and if so, if maybe James and NMAS might be able to chip in with any clarification of what they think might be relevant based on their relevant knowledge. Just because previewing this next piece of text, it feels heavier than usual, or denser, or.
Sure. Just so I don't disappoint you, though, my expertise is not actually so much. Although I'm interested in the tech stuff, my PhD is about anarchism and post-work and post-scarcity from a politics perspective. So I'm equally in as bad shape as you to talk about 1970s computing technology. Sorry to just. I mean, I'll pitch in, but it'll be as clueless as anything that you would say. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go further and say maybe all of us, we can try to do our best to support in any supporting information that will help from our places of relative helplessness on this one.
Yeah, we can all give it a shot together.
Yeah, I'm actually an electronics hobbyist. So
excellent.
If anyone needs any clarifications on what he's mentioning, I could probably answer some of it.
Yeah, and I think I'll just say real quick, leading into this very technical-looking section, what Bookchin really lays out here is, I don't know how many of y'all have read the Mars books by Kim Stanley Robinson, but those read almost like the fiction extension of the ideas he's proposing here. It really lit up my brain there when I heard that, so just a note.
Oh, interesting. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's definitely worth. And
we...
also the stuff about mines, like there's a big tension between like valuing life over like a dead object, like a planet, like Mars. So there's a lot of interesting philosophical stuff there.
Oh yeah, actually, a question that I'd have of people is how do you feel about the proposal to remove human beings from the mining process? I feel like that is something that could be a highly controversial proposal. Although I understand where he's coming from and talking about how it's a hellish thing for participants.
Well, and like industrial mining is probably not great, right? It's probably not sustainable. It's probably not efficient in that large ecological way you were talking about earlier, right? But like, rocks are cool. Couldn't we do like a Bookchinite level, small scale bit of, mining?
Yeah, he actually does explain, I think, at least a little bit about making these processes more efficient on the smaller scale. So that, because, there's only a handful of steel plants in the U.S., and even so much as the one local to me is closing down because their system is inefficient and it costs too much for them to upgrade. So,
yeah, I mean, he alludes a little bit already in the passage Rosa just read about how there are multiple different options in terms of emerging technologies giving different scales, whether there's going to be a human scale or some very completely humanless kind of mega machine scale, right? And I'm not sure if we've passed this section already, but he talks about how we may have the option between almost like a mile long kind of technological conveyor belt where we don't do anything, we just have the shopping carts at the end, pick up the products, or whether we want to integrate ourselves more with the machines, in order to have something to do. So I don't think he's prescribing that nobody must do any mining. It's more about having the option, isn't it? About being freed from the kind of the worst excesses of it.
Yeah, well,
and we basically already live in that world that he's describing. I mean, have you guys seen those like videos of Amazon warehouses and things where you can just you see the like delivery robots going from place to place very intelligently and having the pathing all sorted out and stuff, and then just right at the end there's one human packing it.
That's that really hits one of the key points of one of my favorite texts in Inventing the Future, and the Accelerationist Manifesto that it's based on. Srly and Williams propose a tension sort of within capitalism, that these technological innovations are always being put towards the ends of profit. So we have this capacity, and that the socialist project, in a sense, is calling to actually fully use the technology for the purposes of actual human liberation. So we have all this automation technology. Now it's the year 2020. He wrote this in 1955. And what did we automate? We automated Amazon factories, and or you have like the cashier, like the automatic self-checkout type thing. It's profitable, so they'll develop it. But are they going to develop something where we like retrofit our houses with self-automated cleaning equipment? Was that the realm of potentiality over the last 70 years? I think it was. Like, we could have done that. We could be in a situation where, like, in the current day, all new houses were built, so like laundry, dishes, all these sort of like things around could just be jetsonized into the house, which would free up a lot of people's labor. Yeah, go on.
Just a recommendation on that in terms of like reading Dolores Hayden's book. Oh, why do I forget what things are called? The Grand Domestic Revolution. She pulls together material feminist plans for different types of architectures that like include kitchenless houses. It's a good read.
That sounds really fascinating. A kitchenless house is a liberatory project is something I wouldn't have guessed.
Yeah.
But I guess it depends what your like relationship to the kitchen is.
Yeah, and she talks a lot about like communal kitchens and things like that, and how architecture has become sort of oppressive to the family structure and things. It's a really, really good book.
If I can just jump in on something Sean just said as well. To me, this is one of the most important take-homes about the relationship between politics and technology, which is that I think people tend to assume that when new technologies are invented, they're following just purely some purely technical course. So, there's just inventors and technicians, and they just make new discoveries, and there's a certain trajectory that technologies, any type of technology, domestic, communications or manufacturing technology, they just take this path because that's what people happen to discover or happen to invent. Sean, what you were just talking about is how at every juncture since the Industrial Revolution, we've had all of these different choices, actually. We could choose to investigate the automation of absolutely anything we want. It is always a political choice. That's something that I think most people don't think about when they think about technology. They imagine technology just unfolds in a certain course rather than us choosing what we develop, us choosing our priorities.
Yeah, and we're sort of like sold that as the idea of technology is this inevitably progressing thing that we neutrally put faith in, that there's going to be flying cars and stuff, and we can trust that just the systems in place are working towards that. Technology is this process that goes forward. And yeah, first we happen to get automated cashiers, but we technology works for everyone equally. It's not a political choice. Technology is this neutral thing that just moves forward.
A good person. Oh, go on.
I was just going to say the reality is the opposite. Like technological development is like fundamentally political, and is like is a condition of the politics that it comes out in.
Exactly. Yeah. A good person to look up on this exact topic actually is the English socialist Raymond Williams. He wrote a book like this is kind of his exact thing. So he was focused particularly on the development of television as a technology, and he in this book he makes precisely the point that the not only the invention of the television itself as a device, but everything to do with television technology, having channels, the whole format of TV, through its very development from very early communications devices, was the result of all of these different choices that were made that completely determined what television was like. It's just an eye-opening read. He takes you right back to the 1800s when these very early communication devices are being developed, and shows you a lot of these paths not taken. It just so happened that television became a broadcast medium where one person can sit on the TV and speak into everyone's living rooms. It's just worth potentially looking up. Raymond Williams, I think it's called it's just called Television, or it's something like that.
Sweet. We'll add that to the show notes as well. We're trying to provide the resources for people interested. They can look more. So Rush, do you want to pick up the reading where we were at before? Not able to hear you. I'm not sure if there's maybe a tech. Maybe like a mic sensitivity issue or something. And yeah, no worries. It happens. Here, I'll read a bit, and then when Rush is ready, then he can hop in and take over.
Also, I earlier had a similar problem where my mic just stopped working, and I had to quit the chat and come back. So maybe that'll work for you, Rush.
The new technology and the human scale. In 1945, J. Presper Eckert Jr. and John W. Moakley of University of Pennsylvania unveiled ENIAC, ENIAC, the first digital computer to be designed entirely along electronic principles. Commissioned for use in solving ballistic problems, ENIAC required nearly 3 years of work to design and build. The computer was enormous. It weighed more than 30 tons, contained 18,800 vacuum tubes with 500,000 connections. These connections took Eckert and Moakley 2.5 years to solder, a vast network of resistors and miles of wiring. The computer required a large air conditioning unit to cool its electronic components. It often broke down or behaved erratically, requiring time-consuming repairs and maintenance. Yet, by all previous standards of computer development, ENIAC was an electronic marvel. It could perform 5,000 computations a second, generating electrical pulse signals that cycled at 100,000 a second. Neither of the mechanical or electromechanical computers in use at the time could approach this rate of computational speed. Some 20 years later, the Computer Control Company of Framingham, Massachusetts, I'm Canadian, offered the DDP-124 for public sale. The DDP-124 is a small, compact computer that closely resembles a bedside AM radio receiver. The entire ensemble, together with a typewriter and memory unit, occupies a typical office desk. The DDP-124 performs over 285,000 computations a second. It has a true stored program memory that can be expanded to retain nearly 33,000 words. The memory of ENIAC, based on preset plug wires, lacked anything like the flexibility of present-day computers. Its pulses cycle at 1.7 billion per second. The DDP does not require any air conditioning unit. It is completely reliable and creates very few maintenance problems. It can be built at a fraction of the cost required to construct ENIAC. The difference between ENIAC and DDP-124 is one of degree rather than kind. Leaving aside their memory units, both digital computers operate according to the same electronic principles. ENIAC, however, was composed primarily of traditional electronic components, such as vacuum tubes, resistors, etc., and thousands of feet of wire. The GDP-124, on the other hand, relies primarily on microcircuits. These microcircuits are very small electronic units that pack the equivalent of INEX key electronic components into squares a mere fraction of an inch in size. Paralleling the miniaturization of computer components is the remarkable sophistication of traditional forms of technology. Ever smaller machines are beginning to replace large ones. For example, a fascinating breakthrough has been achieved in reducing the size of continuous hot strip steel rolling mills. This kind of mill is one of the largest and costliest facilities in modern industry. It may be regarded as a single machine, nearly half a mile in length, capable of reducing a 10-ton slab of steel about 6 inches thick and 50 inches wide to a thin strip of sheet metal a tenth or a 12th of an inch thick. I started laughing because my mind was not able to grasp what I was saying. This installation alone, including heating furnaces, coilers, long roller tables, scale breaker stands, and buildings, may cost tens of millions of dollars and occupy 50 acres or more. It produces 300 tons of steel sheet an hour. To be used efficiently, such a continuous hot strip mill must be operated together with large batteries of coke ovens, open hearth furnaces, blooming mills, etc. Does anyone know what coke ovens and blooming mills are? Open hearth sort of sounds like it's open somehow, the furnace, but I don't know what a blooming mill is, or a coke oven. Maybe it's a cake oven.
So the coke is the fuel for the steelworks, isn't it? And then blooming is part of the steel production process. I don't know what blooming actually does, but I think it has to do with the steel kind of coming out of something in the shape of roughly a shape of a bloom or a flower or something.
Oh, interesting.
Don't quote me on that.
These facilities, in conjunction with hot and cold rolling mills, may cover several square miles. Such a steel complex is geared towards a national division of labor to highly concentrated sources of raw materials, generally located at a great distance from the complex, and to large national and international markets. Even if it's totally automated, its operating and management needs far transcend the capabilities of a small, decentralized community. The type of administration it requires tends to foster centralized social forms. Fortunately, we now have a number of alternatives. Rosh, are you good to go?
If you can hear me, I think I am.
I can hear you. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. Fortunately, we now have a number of alternatives, more efficient alternatives in many respects to the modern steel complex. We can replace blast furnaces and open hearth furnaces by a variety of electric furnaces, which are generally quite small and produce excellent pig iron and steel. They can operate not only with coke, but also with anthracite coal, charcoal, and even lignite. Or we can choose the HYL process, HYL process, a batch process in which natural gas is used to turn high-grade ores or concentrates into sponge iron. Or we can turn to the Weiberg process, which involves the use of charcoal, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen. In any case, we can reduce the need for coke ovens, blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, and possibly even solid reducing agents. Of the more important steps towards scaling a steel complex to community dimensions is the development of the planetary mill by T. Sinzimir. The planetary mill reduces the typical continuous hot strip mill to a single planetary stand and a light finishing stand. Hot steel slabs, 2 1/4 inches thick, pass through 2 small pairs of heated feed rolls and a set of work rolls mounted in 2 circular cages, which also contain 2 backup rolls. By operating the cages and backup rolls at different rotational speeds, the work rolls are made to turn in 2 directions. This gives the steel skib terrific mauling and reduces it to a thickness of only 1/10 of an inch. Sinzimir's planetary mill is a stroke of engineering genius. The small work rolls, turning in 2 circular cages, replace the need for the 4 huge rough stands and 6 finishing stands in a continuous hot strip mill. The rolling of hot steel slabs by the Sinzimir process requires a much smaller operational area than a continuous hot strip mill. With continuous casting, moreover, we can produce steel slabs without the need for large, costly slabbing mills. A future steel complex based on electric furnaces, continuous casting, a planetary mill, and a small continuous cold-reducing mill will require a fraction of the acreage occupied by conventional installation. It would be fully capable of meeting the steel needs of several moderate-sized communities with low quantities of fuel. The complex I have described is not designed to meet the needs of a national market. On the contrary, it is suited for meeting the steel requirements of a smaller moderate-sized communities and industrially undeveloped countries. Most electric furnaces for pig iron production produce about 100 to 250 tons a day, while large blast furnaces produce 3,000 tons a day, or daily rather. Planetary mill can roll only 100 tons of steel strip an hour, roughly a third of the output of a continuous hot strip mill. Yet the very scale of our hypothetical steel complex constitutes one of its most attractive features. Also, the steel produced by our complex is more durable, so the community's rate of replenishing its steel products would be appreciably reduced. Since the smaller complex requires ore, fuel, and reducing agents in relatively small quantities, many communities could rely on local resources for their raw materials, thereby conserving the more concentrated resources of centrally located sources of supply, strengthening the independence of the community itself vis-a-vis the traditional centralized economy, and reducing the expense of transportation. What would at first glance seem to be a costly, inefficient duplication of effort that would be avoided by building a few centralized steel complexes would prove, in the long run, to be more efficient as well as socially more desirable. The new technology has produced not only miniaturized electronic components and smaller production facilities, but also highly versatile multi-purpose machines. For more than a century, the trend in machine design moved increasingly toward technological specialization and single-purpose devices, underpinning the intensive division of labor required by the new factory system. Industrial operations were subordinated entirely to the product. In time, this narrow pragmatic approach has, quote, led industry far from the rational line of development in production machinery, end quote, observe Eric W. Lever and John J. Brown. Quote, it has led to increasingly uneconomic specialization. Specialization of machines in terms of end product requires that the machine be thrown away when the product is no longer needed. Yet the work of the production machine does can be reduced to a set of basic functions, forming, holding, cutting, and so on, and these functions, if correctly analyzed, can be packaged and applied to operate as on a part as needed, end quote. Ideally, a drilling machine of the kind envisioned by Lever and Brown would be able to produce a small hole enough to hold a thin wire large enough to admit a pipe. Machines by this operational range were once regarded as economically prohibitive. By the mid-1950s, however, a number of such machines were actually designed and put to use. In 1954, for example, a horizontal boring mill that was built in Switzerland for the Ford Motor Company's River Road plant at Dearborn, Michigan. This boring mill would qualify beautifully as a Lever and Brown machine. Equipped with 5 optical microscope-type illuminated control gauges, the mill drills holes smaller than a needle's eye or larger than a man's fist. The holes are accurate to a 10,000th of an inch.
I wanted to ask NMass about his note here, if he's...
All right, so in manufacturing, especially in the machining aspect of manufacturing, a 10,000th of an inch, which is 0.001 of an inch, that's commonly just referred to as a tenth, whereas most people who hear tenth, they assume 0.1 of an inch. Generally, the scale on which a machinist works is much smaller, so we call a tenth a 10,000th of an inch a tenth of an inch. To put this this sizing into perspective, a normal sheet, from a ream of A4 paper that we commonly have laying around. A normal sheet of that, depending on which mill that paper was made, is generally 4 to 5 thousandths of an inch. And we actually, in manufacturing, use sheets of normal printer paper as touch-off aids a lot, because it is, you measure it and then you know exactly what it's at. You know that whole sheet of paper is going to be that exact size, because that's just how the manufacturing process has evolved within just paper itself.
Interesting. So you use paper as a reference point for other small sizes?
Yeah, a shim, if you will. You can also touch tooling off on it. And actually, when you're 3D printing, usually the nozzle to plate distance is usually around a sheet of a paper. So when you're setting your machine up, you'd use a sheet of paper and you drag it between the workpiece area and the extruder, and that
Make sure
distance
it's level
is,
to bed.
yeah, they call it bed leveling, but level's not really the correct term, because you're kind of ensuring that the bed is perpendicular all the way around to the nozzle. So it doesn't really have to do with level in that sense, but it's commonly referred to as that.
Nmas, are you available right now to pick up reading up until your next note?
Yeah. I just I finished a sandwich. I feel like you guys didn't want to hear the ASMR of me eating a sandwich. Kind of muted myself.
We'll do that on a different stream.
We could be YouTube famous. The importance of machines with this kind of operational range can hardly be overestimated. They make it possible to produce a large variety of products in a single plant. A smaller, moderate-sized community using multi-purpose machines can satisfy many of its limited industrial needs without being burdened with underused industrial facilities. There would be less loss in scraping tools, which I'm going to rant about after this paragraph a little bit. Less loss in scraping tools and less need for single-purpose plants. The community's economy would be more compact and versatile, more rounded and self-contained than anything we find in the communities of industrial advanced countries. The effort that goes into retooling machines for new products would be enormously reduced. Retooling would generally consist of changing in dimensioning rather than in design. Finally, multi-purpose machines with a wide operational range are relatively easy to automate. The changes required to use these machines in a cybernated industrial facility would generally be in circuitry and programming rather than in machine form and structure. So he's, and I'd like to point out that in this era, NC and later on CNC controlled machines, as we know them currently, weren't around. I think the first CNC punch card machines were at General Electric, and I think that was the early 70s. So we really didn't see them out in shops until around the 80s. And I was going to rant on about he mentioned scraping tools here, and the process of hand scraping is probably the most specialized process, and it's the most accurate that you can get with a hand tool. I'm not sure how in depth I want to go with that. There's a lot of videos on YouTube about hand scraping, but it's commonly used in machine manufacture by a machine tool builder to get surfaces on the machine incredibly flat, and it is a hand process. A hand scraping tool looks like kind of a chisel with a different grind on the end. And but if you want more about that, I'll throw up some YouTube links.
And do you think that the scraping stuff is something that should be automated?
Well, nowadays, with machine manufacture, usually a scraping hand, which is how people are referred to, that do scraping for a living, they're a scraping hand, which may be where hand came from, like lend a hand. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But usually these people were actually employed in a lot of factories, but it's not so much common these days. Usually it's such a specialized skill set that these people would only be employed now by actual just the machine tool manufacturer or a shop that reconditions machines, used machines. So in modern times now, with the amount of technology we have, a lot of machines run on linear rails instead of hand scraped in boxways. And the ways are the axes in this case. So a lot of that's been just taken out completely by technology. But there are still areas where hand scraping is the only way to do to get that level of accuracy, and it's a little bit more common in the millwright in people that do millwright stuff, because steam turbines are notoriously hand scraped in, and it is a huge process that takes a long time.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
I'll throw up a link because I'm I'm failing to describe this sort of in depthly.
Yeah, it strikes me as it's a very I think what's fascinating about it to me is how much it's where it comes from in the specialization of your workplace and stuff. It's wrapping my mind around it is interesting in this context of post-scarcity anarchism. James, do you want to pick up from where we're at to do some reading?
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. If you're ready to hand off en masse.
Oh yeah, by all means.
Whereabouts did you get up to? Sorry.
So we're starting at single-purpose machines, and I'll make a note that wherever we leave off, I'm trying to highlight in the live stream.
Yeah. So I'm starting at single-purpose machines.
Yeah.
Single-purpose machines, of course, would continue to exist, and they would still be used for mass manufacture of a large variety of goods. At present, many highly automatic single-purpose machines could be employed with very little modification by decentralized communities. Bottling and canning machines, for example, are compact, automatic, and highly rationalized installations. We can expect to see smaller automatic textile, chemical processing, and food processing machines. A major shift from conventional automobiles, buses, and trucks to electrical vehicles would undoubtedly lead to industrial facilities much smaller in size than existing automobile plants. Many of the remaining centralized facilities could be effectively decentralized simply by making them as small as possible and sharing their use among several communities. I do not claim that all of humanity's economic activities can be completely decentralized, but the majority surely can be scaled to human and communitarian dimensions. This much is certain: we can shift the center of economic power from national to local scale and from centralized bureaucratic forms to local popular assemblies. This shift would be a revolutionary change of vast proportions, for it would create powerful economic foundations for the sovereignty and autonomy of the local community. That takes us to the next section. Shall I proceed with the next section?
Sounds good to me.
Sure. So the next section is the ecological use of technology. I've tried thus far to deal with the possibility of eliminating toil, material insecurity, and centralized economic control issues, which, if utopian, are at least tangible. In the present section, I'd like to deal with a problem that may seem highly subjective, but which is nonetheless of compelling importance: the need to make humanity's dependence on the natural world a visible and living part of our culture. Actually, this problem is peculiar only to a highly urbanized and industrialized society. In nearly all pre-industrial cultures, humanity's relationship to its natural environment was well defined, viable, and sanctified by the full weight of tradition. Changes in season, variations in rainfall, the life cycles of plants and animals on which humans depended for food and clothing, the distinctive feature of the area occupied by the community. All of these were familiar and comprehensible, and evoked in human beings a sense of religious awe and oneness with nature, and, more pragmatically, a sense of respectful dependence. Looking back to the earliest civilizations of the Western world, we rarely find evidence of a system of social tyranny so overbearing and ruthless that it ignored this relationship. Barbarian invasions and, more insidiously, the development of commercial civilizations may have destroyed the reverential attitude of agrarian cultures towards nature. But the normal development of agricultural systems, however exploitive they were of human beings, rarely led to the destruction of the soil and terrain. During the most oppressive periods in the history of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the ruling classes kept the irrigation dikes in good repair and tried to promote rational methods of food cultivation. Even the ancient Greeks, heirs to a thin mountainous forest soil that suffered heavily from erosion, shrewdly reclaimed much of the arable land by turning to orchardry and viticulture. It's the growing of grapes, by the way. It was not until commercial agricultural systems and highly urbanized societies developed that the natural environment was unsparingly exploited. Some of the worst cases of soil destruction in the ancient world were provided by the giant slave-worked commercial farms of North Africa and the Italian peninsula. In our own time, the development of technology and the growth of cities has brought human beings' alienation from nature to the breaking point. Western humanity finds itself confined to a largely synthetic urban environment, far removed physically from the land, and its relationship to the natural world is mediated entirely by machines. Human beings lack familiarity with how most of their goods are produced, and their food bears only the faintest resemblance to the animals and plants from which they were derived. Boxed into a sanitized urban milieu, almost institutional in form and appearance, modern humanity is denied even a spectator's role in the agricultural and industrial systems that satisfy their material needs. The modern human is a pure consumer, an insensate receptacle. It would be unfair, perhaps, to say that it is disrespectful towards the natural environment. The fact is, human beings scarcely know what ecology means, or what their environment requires to remain in balance. The balance between humanity and nature must be restored. I've tried to show elsewhere that unless we establish some kind of equilibrium between humanity and the natural world, the viability of the human species will be placed in grave jeopardy. Here, I'll try to show how the new technology can be used ecologically to reawaken humanity's sense of dependence upon the environment. I shall try to show how, by reintroducing the natural world into human experience, we can contribute to the achievement of human wholeness. I just want to pause there because I think there's a huge amount to discuss. I don't know if everyone's happy to. I just had a couple of comments I wanted to make on that, unless people want me to continue. What's really interesting about this section to me is when I've dealt with this text before at conferences and stuff like that, I think people tend to assume often that the kind of pro-automation, post-scarcity ideas are this kind of tech worshipping, anti-ecological message, right? So I think people have this really reductive tendency to interpret the question of automation as if it's kind of a vicious trade-off between saving the environment or having all this high technology and machinery. So what if I think is really interesting about this bit is that for Bookchin, this prospect of high automation is actually a way to make society more environmentally conscious, more ecologically sound, right? And I think that's one of the really important things, because I think a lot of critics of the post-scarcity idea have a very stereotypical view of it as this kind of tech at all costs, environment be damned type of attitude. But I mean, Bookchin himself saw these as actually interrelated. So, like, by increasing our level of technological development in a certain direction, we're actually making a more ecological society. I think that goes against what a lot of people assume about automation, right? They assume there has to be this trade-off where we build all these machines that make our lives easy and convenient, and to do that, we sacrifice, ecological consciousness. But actually, here Bookchin's kind of saying, we can have both, right? They actually help each other.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point in terms of how the two could be mutually supportive. And it's definitely, I think, one of the main criticisms I've run into from people who haven't read much social ecology when if you start talking positively about technology and stuff, like there's a really strong sort of like anti-technology current in some parts of the left. So I've faced that sort of like that exact sort of criticism just because endorsing ecological technology, it's almost sort of believed that ecological technology is a contradiction, but I don't think the evidence shows that's the case.
And it's just an interesting aside as well. Bookchin himself faced a lot of that criticism in his lifetime because, so I mean, in advancing social ecology as a position, he came into often quite embittered like battles of words against against the so-called deep ecologists, so people who believed that in more of a kind of nature first humanity versus nature dichotomy, and also against it like a more anarcho-primitivist thinkers like John Zerzan and Bob Black. They got into real disputes with Bookchin over precisely this type of issue, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, his sort of characterization of them would be that their lack of technological use would actually is tantamount to passively allowing deaths to happen and suffering to happen. And I don't know. I've talked to people on the other side of this sort of like divide with Bookchin, and a lot of the individuals who identify with these ideas are a lot more nuanced than that. But the anti-technology stuff is something I think is a real problem when it arises.
Shall I carry on with the classical utopians?
I'm up for that. I just wanted to check in that because we've been going for about 2 hours now, and this is I think the longest chapter of the book, and we're somewhere around, let's see, we're somewhere around like halfway through this chapter at this point, and I just wanted to check in if how long people wanted to go with it, or how long people are available to continue, and maybe consider splitting it up just based on the length of this chapter, and maybe do 2 weeks on this chapter.
Yeah, I can't go for another 2 hours.
No, me neither.
Yeah, I think there's so much going on in this chapter that it would probably be beneficial to do it in 2 broadcasts and maybe 2 weeks of discussion.
I think.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
I think it will be, because if we can't get through this together, I don't think it's fair to ask people to get through this by themselves.
Seems cruel.
And yeah, so I think let's. Do you want to, James? Do you want to go to the end of the page and then maybe have Rosa take over for a page until we'll see if we sort of hit like a natural end of a subsection, and then we can just wrap up there, and we'll call that we'll let people know that's where we're reading to this week.
That sounds good to me, Rosa. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. Off I go. The classical utopians fully realized that the first step towards wholeness must be to remove the contradiction between town and country. It is impossible, wrote Fourier nearly a century and a half ago, to organize a regular and well-balanced association without bringing into play the labors of the field, or at least gardens, orchards, flocks and herds, poultry yards, and a great variety of species, animal and vegetable. Shocked by the social effects of the Industrial Revolution, Fourier added, "They are ignorant of this principle in England, where they experiment with artisans, with manufacturing labour alone, which cannot by itself suffice to sustain a social union." To argue that the modern urban dweller should once again enjoy, quote, "the labours of the field," might well seem like a gallows humour. A restoration of peasant agriculture, prevalent in Fourier's day, is neither possible nor desirable. Charles Guide was surely correct when he observed that agricultural labour, quote, "is not necessarily more attractive than industrial labour. To till the earth has always been regarded as a type of painful toil, of toil which is done, quote, with the sweat of one's brow. Fourier does not answer this objection by suggesting that his phalansteries will mainly cultivate fruits and vegetables instead of grains. If our vision
there, we have a note in our thing of what a phalanstery is. It's a self-sustaining cooperative community of that's made by the followers of Fourier. So it's an unfamiliar word, so we wanted to define it.
Yeah, it's actually kind of cool. It's also a special building in which Fourierist utopians were supposed to live. So it's kind of like a dorm room for utopian socialists. Actually, there are some cool pictures of them. Actually, if you Google phalanstery. And it comes from the term of living in a phalanx, like the old ancient rows of soldiers or whatever. The idea is that everyone's going to live in these very utopian, almost like dorm room blocks, where they'll all help each other to do utopian farming and playful, non-arduous toil.
That's interesting. Rosa, what were you saying?
Oh, just going to say that reading his writings is quite delightful, and he's a very interesting and extreme person, and there's lots of sort of writing about how society should be divided up into groups of maximum 9 people, and those should be living, phalansteries of 9 people times 9 people. Like it's like a lot of like aesthetic stuff. And I think at some point he said that like his prediction for the future was that the oceans were going to turn into something that resembled lemonade. So there's just like a lot of joy to be had.
He had some amazing, an amazing mix of like what we would consider serious socialist ideas, together with almost science fiction fancies. So another one he said was that he considered the melon, the fruit melon, to be the melon of the fruit of harmony. And his evidence for this was that all different types of animal like to eat melon, including cats. He said that cats like to eat melon, which is actually true. It happens, but again, Rosa's exactly right. You read through his texts, he says all of this stuff that you might expect to see in like Marx or Kropotkin or something like that, and all of a sudden, some very out there theory about and people will grow tails under socialism, or the sea will be drinkable under socialism. It's really great fun, and you never quite know when he's serious or not.
I need to read this guy. I love that. I love the idea of all of that, because I've thought about that too in terms of like in sort of like gags that we do on the show, is that you sort of when you play something really silly, really straight, it like forces the audience to engage critically. It's like you can't just listen to Fourier literally in order to get his point. You have to keep your mind closed off to the possibility that people will grow tails in order to get a good read of it.
There's another book that I would really like to recommend, just on the insane vein, that doesn't do much of the actual practical stuff, which is Road Town by Edgar, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, Chambliss. And it's his plan for a city that is like, it's like completely consecutive, like all the houses are after each other, and he does these wonderful descriptions of like going onto the roof and being transported from one house to another by like a rail that you sort of hook onto. It's basically like Zipline Town. It's really great. It's short and it's a really good read.
That's amazing. I'm just looking at the cover here on the Gutenberg archive.
Oh god. There's a chapter called The Servant Problem. And the entire chapter consists of a sentence saying, "Road Town will not have a servant problem," and then you go on to the next chapter. It's fun.
A succinct solution. Does it ever define what the servant problem is?
It's not entirely clear to me. I think everyone at the time was like, "Oh, the servant problem. We must engage with that." In some way, so maybe it was more contextual at the time.
Maybe
the problem of having servants.
Who's going to do the dirty work? I guess. So Fourier, the guy in the text here, he had an interesting solution in the phalansteries to who was going to do the dirty work, right? So it's the age-old question of who's going to clean the toilets under socialism, or who's going to do the washing up or whatever. And so Fourier thought that because children, it's kind of dark now actually when you say it in the modern day, but in the 1800s, it must have seemed very whimsical. He said, "Oh well, children love getting their hands dirty and playing around in the dirt. So we can just make a game out of cleaning up the phalanstery, And so kids will do all of these grotty chores around these utopian buildings just because they'll love to mess around and stuff like that. I guess it sounds a bit like child labor now when you put it into contemporary context, but that was Fourier's solution."
It's just the Mary Poppins strategy, right?
What, a spoonful of sugar? Yeah. Full of dirt under the phalanstery.
The utopian solution to just convince people that things are good is my favorite political strategy in the world, of being like, how are we going to distribute all the billionaires' wealth? Oh, we'll just convince them it's good to do that. How are we going to get people to to clean up garbage? Well, we'll convince children that it's fun and it's a game to do all the dirty work around the house.
Yeah. Well,
utopian.
Yeah, I mean, to draw it back to the question of post scarcity and work abolition, like one of the strengths of what Bookchin proposes, compared with what someone like Bob Black proposes, is precisely that. At least, I suppose Bookchin's talking about like materially removing the need to do work rather than just changing how we feel about doing work. So, like Bob Black and Charles Fourier as well. Yeah, I think Bob Black even mentions Fourier. That there's an element of, well, we'll get rid of work by making these work tasks seem like they're not work. We'll be doing something really enjoyable that has the same effects as work. We just won't feel like we're doing work, and that can feel like a real sham. There are some tasks that just you question how fun it could be made to clean a toilet or to, I don't know, a million other things. So one of Bookchin's strengths as kind of a work abolition model is at least he's talking about the physical removal of the need to work, where rather than this kind of dubious psychological maneuver, right? Gamifying work, gamifying toil.
That's interesting. And can you clarify what you mean? Like maybe expand on that distinction.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about a concept like work abolition or work, the removal of toil, the total, the kind of post-work idea, I guess, to my mind, Bookchin and Bob Black. Bob Black, by the way, is the author of an essay called "The Abolition of Work," which is, and he was a contemporary of Bookchin's. They actually argued bitterly about a lot of topics. To my mind, they represent two different approaches to removing work as a category of kind of human experience. So, Bookchin, to my mind, is much more so than Black interested in physically removing the conditions where we need to work. So, removing that realm of necessity by bringing in machines, right? By producing technical artifacts that can actually physically replace the need for human beings to do work tasks. Whereas Bob Black, he says he's sincere in wanting to abolish work, but the way he wants to go about it, it's not quite as high tech, and a lot of it has to do with exactly what Fourier is saying. Well, we get rid of work by making what used to be work into a fun sort of game. So, what used to be this drudgery task of cleaning the toilets in the phalanstery building, now we all play at cleaning the toilets, and so it's just not work anymore because it's a fun thing. We enjoy it now. So to me, that there's the question is where in what context is the work abolition happening? Is it happening out there in physical reality where robots are replacing people, for example, or is it happening in our minds where what we think of as work just we don't think of that as work anymore. It's so much fun that we do it voluntarily, or we don't call it work anymore. It doesn't seem like work.
Just to add on to that, I think that's a really important distinction. One thing I think is interesting is because you're framing it in terms of fun, and that's obviously that's pretty ridiculous to some degree on the face of it. But then when you're talking like one thing that we do in our society is to really disrespect a lot of types of more manual and more essential labor. So perhaps there's a solution that involves actually respecting people who clean things to make that labor, not that it's not toil anymore, but it's not horrible toil.
Yeah, part of what makes this sort of stuff degrading or dehumanizing is to be forced to do things that are time consuming or repetitive or just not an enjoyable game. Digging ditches or whatever is not fun. I just lost my train of thought slightly. I'll have to come back to it. I'll catch it on the next orbit. That's what I say if I lose my thought.
Well, I just wanted to agree with Rosa, really, that there are lots of things that are unpleasant about manual labor, and it's almost like there's this compounding factor under capitalism where it's also devalued, devalorized, right? So one solution, one way to make work better, to make it less arduous, is to valorize it, to say, and actually we have a really interesting example of this happening right now. So in the media discourse around the COVID-19 crisis, there's been a bit of a shift, I suppose, in public perception where the idea of a key worker, people who perform what might conventionally be seen as menial or manual tasks, like being a grocery store worker, are receiving a lot more public attention and perhaps slightly more public praise than they would under pre-virus capitalism, because people are starting to see the value of what's actually being done there. So it's like there is a bit of an example of I suppose it highlights how little valorized, for example, working in a supermarket normally is, now that people are coming out and clapping for supermarket workers or for NHS workers and so on.
That was the point. That totally reminds me is it's sort of like the bullshit jobs thing, is that we esteem this category of jobs that people are sort of praised when they reach this sort of I'm getting a salary and I sit at a desk and I work for 3 out of 8 hours, and it's like a different, but there's a real esteem towards that sort of thing. There's a real esteem to different areas of society. But then when people are forced to do non-fun things for long periods of time, and then they're not esteemed for it, where it's treated as I think that's what's dehumanizing and degrading about, say, the relationship between a boss and employee is employees are like, hey, we make this place fucking work. And how can you treat us like this? And I mean, that's, I think heretofore all existing history has been that, but.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember as well, though, that the negative social perception of manual labor is not all that's unpleasant about manual labor. So there's definitely a strong argument, I think, for that abolitionist position, where even if we can make toil and drudge work and so on make it highly respected in society, it would improve the situation, just like it would improve the situation if it was safer, if we had to do it for less time and so on. But there's still something unpleasant about certain tasks where the actual experience of doing them is very unpleasant, regardless of how people regard it. So it's
like bum wiper.
Yeah, and there are that's a real job. I mean, there are people who have to wipe bums for a living. And yeah, it's difficult to imagine, even if that was the most valorized job on earth.
Every morning, at 5 a.m, everyone gets up.
It might not be gamified.
Bum wipers. It's an amazing thought. Just the way that the service employees are being valorized with the 7 a.m. like here in Vancouver where we are, like at 7:00 every night. I think it's in the night and not the morning. Everyone like starts banging pots and stuff and cheering for the workers who are going to work and stuff from their balconies. And the idea of
we have clapping.
Doing that for bum wipers really cracks me up. Even
Hashtag clap for bum wipers. Yeah.
But bum wipers are the front and center. Crisis workers in the caring economy in regular life. Like we should applaud them every night.
Yeah, we shouldn't trivialize it. Like it's obviously it's funny because it's a squeamish topic, but I mean it truly is degrading and degraded job. But I mean again, it's a useful test case because we can imagine even in a world where people in that role were really valorized. Would we as a society still take the opportunity to automate that process, or any process like that?
Yeah, or would we keep it going specifically because we're like, we can't let the noble bum wipers down, and they'll lose their jobs. We have to. And I don't say that to be trivializing, but I do say it because it's really funny. It's just really inherently a funny combination of words. But I apologize for any sort of bad interpretations that are possible.
Don't worry, I won't report you to the Guild of Bum Wipers. On that highbrow note, should we continue to the end of the paragraph, or I think Rosa, you were going to take up the next.
Sure.
I think I just realized while we were having this little rapport that we had just started a section. So I think it might make sense for us just to restart at the beginning of the section next week. I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sounds good.
I think ending with a little bit of banter, recommendations, and sort of stuff is really great. So I think this has been a successful experiment, and I really want to thank you both and en masse for being part of this, and also everyone who was on the stream. A big round of applause for them because I think it went really well and was really fun. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for putting it on, and thanks for having us. Great.
For sure.
And,
it really is lovely.
It's been amazing, yeah. Rosa, was this the first time you've been in this book group as well?
Yeah. No, I just actually joined the Discord today, so.
Yeah. No, same here. So it's obviously a really good recruitment tool, right? Both of us have joined just for this episode. But I mean, I'll be back for next week if it's. Is it same time next week?
The time on Thursdays is fluctuating because of strictly technological limitations with learning how to stream and stuff. But yeah, generally we're doing the readings on Thursdays. I think in the starting from somewhere between like 11 to 1, 11 in the morning to 1 PDT, my time zone, depending on when we get the stream up and running. For the time being, just being totally honest, I've found this whole process very perplexing, getting this out here. And we started like 45 minutes later than we intended to today.
Great, no, it's fine. Don't worry.
An observation on the just an observation on the time that this has taken. I was recently reading that Graeber Bullshit Jobs book, and he talks about like pre-clock time, and he talks about like, I'm going to see you in 2 boilings of an egg, or a cooking of a pot of rice, and that used to be how people measured time. This podcast has this episode has taken me a making of a pearl barley stew. So
wow.
It's a very satisfying amount of time. It's pretty much exactly the amount of time.
Great multitasking. So you've been stewing whilst book grouping as well.
Yeah, I mean, stewing is a very low intensity. I mean, the best thing you can do is just leave it alone. So that's my kind of cooking.
I'm going to challenge myself to next week be stewing during this process because I've got no stew right now and I feel like a real schmuck.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel.
No, it's okay. I'll just carry this. It's a deep wound for sure, but
I didn't mean to stew shame you.
Yeah, actually, I think one production of a barley stew is probably about the ideal maximum length for one of these readings. So it's a good measuring device. We should always have someone making a stew just to keep a lid on it.
I agree. We should totally make that a thing, even if it's just an inside joke thing. I don't know. It just adds to the layer of fun here.
Oh, I should do a little bit of business stuff here for the end of the stream. So everyone going forward on the book club, we're going to be meeting at 7:23 GMT every Wednesday. So there's one recording at 7 GMT, which picks up. It splits up people in an effective way and hits our two main clusters of participants effectively. So we're going to be 7 and 23 GMT on Wednesdays going forward for the rest of post-scarcity anarchism, and we're also going to be doing this stream every day on every week on Thursday following that. This will all be publicly available, so you can listen back to old streams and catch up and stuff like that. So I just wanted to make a note of that to everyone who's listening along. You're also everyone's invited to be part of the sort of book club planning group. So we've got a secret channel called Team Book Club in the Discord, where we have like meta discussions and we sort of make stuff work. And so everyone's invited to be part of that, and everyone's invited to be part of these streams on Thursdays, jumping in. If we get to having like a lot of people on the stream, we'll have to figure out some sort of mitigation stuff. Frankly speaking, I mean, you can't have like a zillion people all talking, but we want to have it open and rotate and stuff. So if, for example, we have too much people, then I might step out, for example. But we want to keep it going and keep this resource going and keep this community going, because it's extremely fun and useful. And like, I feel like I'm deepening my understanding a lot through participating in it, and I hope that's the case for everyone else as well.
Yeah, it definitely has been an eye-opener for me, so thank you all.
Yeah, gonna sign off now. Bye guys, nice to meet you.
Bye.
Bye. I do enjoy the fact that the community involvement here has just been so just wonderful with people chipping in, which is why I stepped back a lot reading today, so everyone could just go ahead and read. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was really happy to have so many people drop in today. Like the unexpected extra people helped us make it to 3 hours, which is where we're going to be clocking in here. Yeah, someone in the chat said, "Hey guys" on YouTube, but I don't know if it was just recently or several hours ago. But hello, Anarch. Thanks for tuning in. So yeah, that wraps us up. Any closing thoughts? And before we close off the stream here.
Not really. I'm all thought out for this week, but I'll be looking forward to going back the same time next week.
That was part of the thing too last week, when we were like, we need to bring more people into this, because I think it was the end of an hour and a half last time, and we were like, oh man, our brain's not working. Okay, well, wonderful. Any closing thoughts en masse?
I don't have any really. I think the section that we just did on bum wiping was I don't want to ruin that as being the ending, really, because it was quite amazing.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks for participating, our wonderful panelists today. You're invited to be part of it in the future, and this has been a wonderful, wonderful time. We'll end the show now with a salute, a moment of silence for the noble bum wipers, who we respect and adore sincerely, despite the fact that we've using the word bum wiper to refer to them instead of, which is an intentionally absurd reference to the job they do. Thank you. Okay, have a good week, everyone.